The sea between the islands is black before dawn, a moving darkness broken by pale foam where currents fold over one another. Somewhere beyond the eastern horizon lies Flores, an island that cannot be reached by walking, not even when the planet locks so much water into ice that coastlines advance. During the Ice Age, much of Southeast Asia becomes a broader landmass, but Wallacea remains a world of channels, straits, and isolated islands. The water between them is not a narrow inconvenience. It is a barrier deep enough to survive the lower sea levels, separating familiar animals from strange ones and ordinary evolutionary paths from extraordinary experiments. Flores sits inside that boundary like a laboratory cut off from the mainland. To arrive there, any land animal must cross open water, whether by deliberate voyage, accidental rafting, or some method that leaves no trace. Once there, escape is just as difficult. Populations become small, resources become limited, predators may disappear or arrive in unfamiliar forms, large animals shrink, small animals sometimes grow, bodies, diets, movement, and behavior are reshaped by the fact that the horizon is surrounded by sea. Long before modern humans reach this part of the world, another kind of human crosses into it. Exactly how this happens remains unknown. No boat survives, no shoreline camp has been found with a clear record of departure. There is no preserved raft, no set of footprints ending at a Pleistocene beach, yet stone tools appear on islands that were never joined to the Asian mainland. On Sulawesi, evidence now places hominins beyond major sea barriers more than 1 million years ago. On Flores, tools from the Soa Basin also point to a human presence of immense antiquity. The evidence remains incomplete, but one conclusion is difficult to avoid. Some early humans moved through island Southeast Asia far earlier than older models of dispersal once allowed. They do not enter an empty paradise. Flores is volcanic, steep, and unstable. Mountains rise sharply above broken valleys. Rivers cut through ash and sediment. Seasons alternate between heavy rain and dryness, and the landscape can change abruptly under eruptions, erosion, and shifting climate. Food is unevenly distributed. Large mammals are rare. The island's best-known herbivores are Stegodon, distant relatives of elephants, some reduced in size by isolation. Giant rats fill ecological roles that would seem unusual on a continent. Reptilian predators patrol the ground. Komodo dragons, or close relatives, turn carcasses into dangerous places where meat and risk arrive together. Into this world comes a human lineage whose future will be shaped not by a march toward greater size or larger brains, but by survival under constraint. This is where the phrase left behind by evolution begins to fail. Evolution has no destination. It does not abandon one species while rewarding another for moving forward. It has no ladder and no obligation to produce taller bodies, larger skulls, or more elaborate technology. On an island, being smaller can be an advantage. A small body needs less food. It may survive shortages that a larger body cannot. Isolation does not stop evolution. Isolation can intensify it. The humans who become known as Homo Floresiensis are not relics standing still while the rest of humanity advances. Their anatomy changes in a different direction. Their bodies become extraordinarily small, but not simply miniature versions of Homo sapiens or Homo erectus. Their limbs, joints, feet, shoulders, skulls, and teeth preserve a mosaic of traits, some apparently ancient, others shaped by life on Flores. They remain committed bipeds, yet their movement may not resemble ours exactly. They make stone tools, yet their technology remains comparatively simple for a very long time. They live among animals that could feed them, kill them, or reach a carcass first. They survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a place where survival itself is evidence of success. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The deeper mystery begins with time. The most famous remains come from Liang Bua, a limestone cave in western Flores, but their story does not begin there. In the Soa Basin, fossils from Mata Menge show that very small-bodied hominins were already present around 700,000 years ago. A fragment of adult upper arm bone is astonishingly small, and nearby teeth represent several individuals. This weakens the old suggestion that the tiny body of the Liang Bua skeleton might reflect disease in one person. Small size appears across individuals and across an enormous span of time. It belongs to a population. The island has therefore been shaping human bodies for longer than the existence of our own species. That length of survival changes the story. Homo floresiensis is often introduced through surprise a tiny human, a small brain, a late date, an evolutionary oddity. But viewed from Flores itself, the stranger fact is how long they endured. Their lineage survives volcanic landscapes, climatic shifts, changing animal communities, and generations of isolation. Their way of life may never produce cities, agriculture, metal, or writing. But those are poor measures of success in an Ice Age island ecosystem. The true measure is continuity. They find enough food, they raise new generations, they learn the terrain, they maintain tool-making traditions. They remain present while environments change around them. What survives in the record suggests that Flores is not a forgotten corner of human evolution. It is one of the places where evolution becomes most visible. Still, the island keeps its central secret. Who were the first arrivals? One possibility is that Homo erectus, already established in Java, crossed eastward and became smaller over many generations. This fits the geography and receives support from some aspects of the Mata Menge teeth and jaw. Another possibility is more unsettling. Perhaps the founding population belonged to a more ancient branch of Homo, retaining features seen in early African species. Scholars still debate how to interpret the mixture of primitive and derived anatomy. Without DNA, and without a more complete early skeleton, no single explanation fully accounts for every feature. The sea crossing is equally uncertain. Early hominins may have reached the island accidentally, perhaps after storms carried groups on natural rafts of vegetation. Yet occupation across Wallacea raises the possibility that some crossings involved planning. Even if the watercraft were extremely simple, deliberate navigation would imply capacities rarely granted to such ancient humans. Accidental arrival creates its own puzzle, because a viable population requires more than one isolated survivor. Either way, the crossing forces a reconsideration of what early humans could do. At sunrise, Flores emerges from the dark water as a wall of green and stone. From a distance, it offers no hint of the long experiment unfolding within it. There are no monuments, roads, or permanent marks visible from the sea. The evidence lies buried in caves, river deposits, stone flakes, animal bones, teeth, and fragments of skeletons so small that one of the most important human stories ever found could fit into a few museum drawers. For hundreds of thousands of years, the people of Flores live beyond the mainland world. They are cut off, but not frozen in time. They are small, but not simple in any meaningful evolutionary sense. Their island does not preserve them unchanged. It remakes them, and much later, in the cool darkness of a cave called Liang Bua, the modern world will finally meet them. Liang Bua does not announce itself like a place destined to overturn human history. The cave opens in a limestone hillside above a river valley in western Flores, broad enough to shelter people and animals, yet quiet enough to preserve layer upon layer of occupation beneath its floor. For generations, local people know the cave. Archaeologists also understand that it contains a deep record of island life. But in 2003, as excavators work downward through compacted sediment, the cave gives up something no one is prepared to recognize. The first bones appear fragile and unusually small. They belong to a partial skeleton lying within deposits that also contain stone tools and animal remains. At first glance, the obvious explanation seems to be a child. The skull is tiny, the limbs are short, the entire individual would have stood only a little over a meter tall. Yet the teeth tell a different story. Their wear and eruption indicate adulthood. The pelvis also belongs to a mature individual. What has been uncovered is not a young member of a familiar human species, but an adult whose body is unlike any recent human known from the archaeological record. The skeleton receives the field designation LB1 for Liang Bua 1. It will soon acquire a more famous nickname, the Hobbit. That nickname captures the public imagination almost immediately, but it also threatens to soften the magnitude of the discovery. LB1 is not a fantasy creature and not merely a miniature person. The remains force researchers to confront a far more difficult possibility. A distinct human species, astonishingly small in body and brain, may have survived on an Indonesian island until a period geologically close to the arrival of Homo sapiens in the region. The excavation team proceeds carefully because the bones are delicate and the sediment around them is damp. Unlike heavily mineralized fossils that resemble stone, parts of LB1 are soft enough to be vulnerable during removal. Every fragment matters. The skull, jaw, pelvis, leg bones, arm bones, hands, and feet together preserve a rare anatomical picture, even though the skeleton is incomplete. Nearby deposits produce additional teeth and bones from other individuals, showing that the small form is not represented by LB1 alone. This point becomes essential. An extraordinary skeleton can always invite an ordinary medical explanation. Perhaps LB1 is a modern human with a growth disorder. Perhaps the skull is small because of disease. Perhaps the proportions are pathological rather than evolutionary. Those alternatives are not unreasonable at the beginning, and they become the center of a prolonged scientific dispute. Yet as more material is studied, the pattern becomes harder to reduce to one unusual individual. Other remains from Liang Bua are also small. Much older fossils from Mata Menge, discovered and analyzed over subsequent years, will eventually show that tiny-bodied hominins were present on Flores hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The cave discovery therefore does not reveal an isolated curiosity. It opens a window onto a Long Island lineage. When the species is formally described in 2004, it is named Homo floresiensis, the human from Flores. The name immediately raises a question that still has no final answer. Where does this human fit in the evolutionary family tree? The skull is small, with a brain volume roughly comparable to much earlier hominins. The body combines traits that resemble Homo erectus, early Homo, and no exact known species. The feet are long relative to the legs. The shoulders and wrists appear unusual. Some features seem unexpectedly ancient for a human living so recently. The shock comes not from smallness alone, but from contradiction. For much of the 20th century, a simplified story of human evolution suggested that later humans generally possessed larger brains, more modern bodies, and increasingly complex technology. Homo floresiensis disrupts that pattern. Here is a human population with a very small brain, living deep into the late Pleistocene and making effective stone tools. The discovery demonstrates that brain size cannot be treated as a simple scale of competence, and that human evolution is not a single procession toward one anatomical design. Liang Bua also complicates the map. Before the Hobbit, the late survival of multiple human species is most strongly associated with Western Eurasia, where Neanderthals overlap in time with Homo sapiens. Flores shows that the human world is even more diverse. Far to the east, beyond deep water crossings, another lineage survives in isolation. Later discoveries elsewhere in Asia will add Denisovans and other difficult-to-classify fossils to this picture. But Homo floresiensis is among the finds that first make the old, narrow model impossible to maintain. The initial chronology makes the discovery even more sensational. Early reports suggest that some Homo floresiensis remains may be as recent as around 12,000 years old, implying that these island humans survived almost into the present geological moment. That date spreads widely and becomes embedded in popular retellings. Later excavation reveals that the cave's deposits are more complicated than first understood. Layers have been eroded, shifted, and redeposited. A major reassessment published in 2016 places the principal Homo floresiensis skeletal remains much earlier, broadly between about 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, while associated stone tool activity continues to roughly 50,000 years ago. The revision removes the most extreme claim, but it does not make the discovery ordinary. Homo floresiensis still survives astonishingly late for a lineage with such unusual anatomy. Its final known presence lies near a period when Homo sapiens is expanding through island Southeast Asia and toward Sahul. Whether the two ever meet remains unknown. The cave contains no secure scene of contact, no mixed burial, no weapon wound, and no genetic evidence extracted from Hobbit remains. The possibility is compelling, but the evidence remains incomplete. Even the cave itself refuses to offer a simple ending. The last fossil at Liang Bua marks the last fossil currently found there, not necessarily the extinction of the species across Flores. Populations may have shifted to other valleys, caves, or parts of the island that have not been excavated. Sediments preserve survival unevenly. Absence after a certain layer can reflect local abandonment, environmental change, erosion, or chance. Archaeology often records the final known trace, not the final living individual. What Liang Bua preserves is a sequence of moments rather than a complete biography. Stone flakes lie among bones of Stegodon, giant rats, birds, reptiles, and other animals. Some bones carry cut marks, others show damage from carnivores or natural processes. Hearth-like staining once encouraged assumptions about controlled fire, but later work makes that evidence less secure. Every object must be separated from the stories researchers naturally want it to tell. That caution matters because the Hobbit quickly becomes surrounded by dramatic images, skilled hunters bringing down dwarf elephants, firelit cave dwellers, a lost tribe surviving unchanged until modern humans arrive. Some of those scenes remain possible in limited form, but none should be accepted simply because they make a satisfying narrative. The newest evidence suggests a harder, more ambiguous life. Homo floresiensis may sometimes have reached large carcasses after reptilian predators. Regular fire use at Liang Bua is not convincingly demonstrated. Their technology works, but it does not reveal their language, rituals, or social organization. The cave gives enough to prove their existence, but not enough to make them familiar. That imbalance is part of the discovery's enduring power. LB1 is unusually complete compared with many ancient hominin finds, yet it remains only one body from a lineage that persists for an immense span of time. A few additional jaws, teeth, and limb fragments expand the sample, but entire populations remain represented by less material than could fill a single graveyard. Their faces cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Their voices are irretrievable. No art or symbolic object can be confidently assigned to them. No DNA has yet survived in a form that can settle their ancestry. Still, the small skeleton in Liang Bua changes the scale of the human past. It shows that recent prehistory contains not one kind of human, spreading through an empty world, but several human lineages occupying very different landscapes. Some live in cold Eurasian plains, some inhabit high mountains, some cross tropical islands. One population on Flores becomes so small that its adult members stand at the height of a young modern human, yet they remain there for hundreds of thousands of years. The discovery is not the story of a lesser humanity uncovered beneath a cave floor. It is the discovery of another successful answer to the problem of being human. And once the first shock fades, the deeper question becomes unavoidable. To understand why their bodies are so small, why their anatomy looks so ancient, and how they persist for so long, Homo floresiensis must be viewed not as a strange object found in a cave, but as the product of an island that changes almost everything arriving on its shores. The island changes the meaning of smallness. On a continent, a body barely more than a metre tall may appear vulnerable beside larger competitors, but Flores does not reward size in the same way. Food is limited, animal communities are unusual, and every generation lives within a closed system where energy matters. A large body requires more calories, more dependable resources, and more space. A smaller body can endure scarcity with less. What looks like reduction from the outside may be refinement within the island itself. This is why Homo floresiensis should not be imagined as a human form that somehow failed to keep pace. The phrase left behind assumes that evolution moves along a single road, with larger brains, taller bodies, and more complex technology waiting at the end. Yet natural selection does not preserve what appears advanced to modern observers. It preserves what continues to reproduce under local conditions. On Flores, a lineage may become smaller not because it has stopped evolving, but because evolution is working with unusual intensity. Island ecosystems repeatedly produce transformations that seem almost inverted when compared with mainland trends. Large mammals often become smaller because reduced resources cannot support their ancestral size. Small animals may become larger when familiar predators or competitors are absent. These patterns are sometimes called island dwarfism and island gigantism, but the names can make the process sound simple. In reality, body size changes through many connected pressures: food availability, growth rate, reproduction, competition, predation, mobility, and the genetic effects of small isolated populations. Homo floresiensis belongs within that wider island story, but humans are not merely another mammal. A change in body size affects the skeleton, the brain, childhood development, energy needs, movement, pregnancy, tool use, and social life. The result is not a scaled-down version of an ancestor. It is a reorganization. Recent research suggests that the very small body and brain of Homo floresiensis may have emerged partly through changes in postnatal growth. Comparisons involving molar proportions and cranial volume raise the possibility that growth slowed significantly after birth, especially during childhood. Under this model, individuals may have begun development along a broadly ancestral pattern and then reached adulthood through a shortened or altered growth trajectory. The idea remains an inference from anatomy rather than a directly observed sequence, because no complete series of infant, juvenile, and adult Homo floresiensis skeletons exists. Still, it offers a more precise mechanism than simply saying the population became smaller. Growth is expensive. A large brain is especially costly tissue, demanding substantial energy even at rest. In an environment where calories may fluctuate and large prey is scarce, reducing the energetic burden of the body could become advantageous over many generations. Yet this does not mean the brain shrinks without consequence, or that intelligence can be measured directly from cranial volume. Homo floresiensis continues to manufacture stone tools despite possessing a brain far smaller than that of Homo sapiens. The tools are not evidence of modern cognition in every sense, but they demonstrate planning, learned technique, and repeated control of stone fracture. The mismatch between small brain size and effective behavior became one of the discovery's most important challenges to older assumptions. Human evolutionary narratives often treated brain expansion as the central engine of adaptability. Homo floresiensis shows that a lineage can survive for immense periods without following the same trajectory. Their success appears to depend on a combination of inherited capacities, learned behavior, social cooperation, ecological knowledge, and low-energy anatomy. None of those abilities requires the body plan of a modern human. The same caution applies to their technology. Simple tools are not necessarily failed tools. If a stone flaking method reliably produces sharp edges for cutting flesh, processing plants, or working other materials, there may be little pressure to replace it. Archaeologists often classify technologies according to complexity, but complexity is not always the same as effectiveness. A tool tradition that remains stable for hundreds of thousands of years may reflect limitation, but it may also reflect successful conservatism. Innovation has costs. New methods require learning, raw materials, experimentation, and sometimes larger social networks. On a small island, dependable solutions can be more valuable than constant change. The people of Flores therefore inhabit a world where efficiency may matter more than expansion. They do not need to become taller to dominate open grasslands or travel across continents. They do not need to support the energetic demands of a much larger brain if familiar landscapes, seasonal knowledge, and inherited skills allow them to survive. They need to locate water, recognize edible plants, avoid dangerous reptiles, find carcasses or vulnerable animals, and move through broken volcanic terrain. Their bodies are shaped by those repeated demands. Even their apparent anatomical primitiveness becomes more complicated in this context. Some features resemble early members of the genus Homo, or even older hominins, while others fit later Asian humans more closely. It is tempting to describe the ancient-looking traits as evolutionary leftovers, but several possibilities remain open. Some may genuinely be retained from a very early ancestor. Others may reappear or become more visible as body proportions change. Still others may represent new island adaptations that only resemble ancient anatomy. Similar form does not always prove direct inheritance. This uncertainty is especially important because no DNA has been recovered from Homo floresiensis. Tropical heat and moisture destroy genetic material quickly, and the cave remains have not yet produced an authenticated genome. Without DNA, researchers must infer relationship from bones and teeth, which can be altered by both ancestry and adaptation. A small jaw may reflect descent, diet, body size, or several processes at once. The evidence remains incomplete, and every evolutionary tree built from anatomy depends on which traits are judged most informative. The idea that LB1 represented a diseased Homo sapiens once offered a way to avoid these complications. Various conditions were proposed to explain the small brain, short stature, or unusual proportions. But pathology becomes increasingly difficult to sustain as the wider record develops. Other Liang Bua individuals share reduced dimensions. The much older Mata Menge remains show extremely small adults, hundreds of thousands of years earlier. At least several individuals are represented there, making it implausible that all belong to a recurring rare disorder that merely imitates a stable island population. Smallness is not an accident at Flores, and it is history. That history may begin with a larger-bodied ancestor arriving from the west, perhaps a form of Homo erectus related to populations known from Java. Once isolated, the founding population could have undergone rapid dwarfing under strong ecological pressure. Alternatively, the first colonists may already have been relatively small and anatomically primitive. In either case, the environment does not preserve them unchanged. It selects, filters, and reshapes. The result survives across an extraordinary span of time. Around 700,000 years ago, tiny hominins already live in the Soa Basin. Tens of thousands of years ago, small-bodied humans remain at Liang Bua. The exact continuity between these populations is inferred rather than proven by a complete fossil sequence. But what survives strongly suggests a deep local evolutionary trajectory. Their small stature is not a brief emergency response. It becomes a durable way of being human. There is something unsettling in that durability because it exposes how narrow modern ideas of humanity can be. Homo sapiens tends to recognize itself as the standard and treat other forms as incomplete approximations. Yet Flores presents a population that does not resemble us closely, does not require our body size, and may not rely on several technologies often considered essential. Their lineage persists anyway. They are not waiting to become modern. They are already adapted to their own world, and as their bones begin to be examined in greater detail, the island's experiment becomes visible not only in their height, but in every part of the body. The skull that holds a surprisingly small brain, the shoulders that do not align like ours, the legs shaped for bipedal movement, and the long feet that carry them across ground no modern human would experience in quite the same way. The body of Homo floresiensis does not behave like a simple-scale model. Shrinking an ancestor should, in theory, preserve the same general proportions in a smaller frame. Yet the skeleton from Liang Bua shows something more complicated. The skull is extremely small, the legs are short, the feet are long, the shoulders sit differently from those of modern humans, and the bones of the wrist preserve a form that seems unexpectedly ancient. Each region tells part of the story, but together they resist any single, comfortable explanation. LB1, the most complete individual, stood a little over 1 meter tall and probably weighed around 25 kilograms, though estimates vary depending on the reconstruction. The skull contained a brain of roughly 400 cubic centimeters, placing it near the range of much earlier hominins and far below Homo sapiens. That number once seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the stone tools found in the same archaeological setting. Yet cranial volume alone does not reveal how neural tissue is organized, how behavior is learned, or how knowledge is shared through a group. The brain is small, but the life supported by that brain lasts across generations. The skull itself combines familiar and strange features. The forehead slopes backward, the brow region is pronounced, The face is not identical to Homo erectus, Homo habilis, or modern humans. The lower jaw lacks a projecting chin, while the teeth are not uniformly primitive or unusually large. Some dental characteristics appear closer to Asian Homo erectus, strengthening the argument that a Javan population may lie somewhere near the ancestry of the Flores lineage. Other traits seem harder to place. Scholars still debate which features reflect inheritance and which emerged as the body became smaller on the island. Below the skull, the contradictions continue. The shoulders appear positioned in a way that may have influenced the range and direction of arm movement. The collarbone and upper limb proportions do not match the modern human pattern exactly. The wrists preserve shapes that have been compared with much earlier hominins, suggesting that the mechanical arrangement of the hand may have differed from ours, even though these people manufactured stone tools. That difference is important. Toolmaking does not require a hand identical to that of Homo sapiens. It requires sufficient grip, coordination, force, and learned control. Homo floresiensis may have achieved those results through a slightly different anatomical system. The arms appear relatively robust for such a small body. This has encouraged suggestions that climbing remained important, or that upper body strength helped with movement across steep terrain. Yet anatomy cannot provide a direct record of behavior. A strong arm does not prove regular climbing, just as a curved bone does not automatically identify a life in the trees. What survives in the record suggests a body that retained some capacities more associated with earlier hominins, while remaining fully capable of terrestrial life. The pelvis shows that LB1 is an adult and confirms the tiny scale of the body. The lower limbs are short relative to the torso, reducing stride length. Walking speed may therefore have been lower than that of a similarly active Homo sapiens, though efficiency depends on more than limb length. Short legs can provide stability on uneven ground, especially where steep slopes, loose volcanic sediments, roots, rocks, and narrow paths interrupt every route. On Flores, movement is not a contest across open plains. It is navigation through broken country. The feet are among the most distinctive parts of the skeleton. They are long compared with the lower legs, and the proportions differ noticeably from modern humans. Early descriptions sometimes made the Hobbit's gait sound awkward or inefficient, but this interpretation has softened as researchers examine the entire lower limb. Homo floresiensis is an obligate biped. It walks on two legs as its normal form of locomotion. The structure is not that of a creature alternating casually between quadrupedal and upright movement. A recently described fragment of the lower fibula adds detail to this picture. The fibula, the slender bone along the outside of the lower leg, helps stabilize the ankle. Its morphology in Homo floresiensis confirms committed bipedalism while preserving differences from Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. The ankle may have allowed somewhat greater mobility, potentially useful on irregular ground. The evidence also leaves open the possibility that climbing remained within their behavioral repertoire, though not necessarily as the dominant form of movement. This flexible ankle is easy to imagine on Flores. The island is not a flat stage. Hillsides rise sharply. Caves open above valleys. Dense vegetation forces detours. Riverbeds alternate between water and exposed stone. A body moving through such terrain benefits from balance, grip, and the ability to place the foot securely at changing angles. What might appear less specialized for long-distance running could be well suited to careful travel through volcanic landscapes. Their gait may have looked unusual to modern observers. Short steps, long feet, and different hip and ankle mechanics would produce a pattern distinct from ours. Yet unusual does not mean ineffective. the population persists long enough for these proportions to become stable. Natural selection does not preserve a fundamentally unworkable walking system for hundreds of thousands of years. The form must have been adequate for finding food, avoiding danger, carrying objects, and moving between shelter and resource zones. The small body also changes how strength should be understood. Homo floresiensis may not have possessed the speed or reach of larger humans, but reduced mass lowers the energy cost of movement. A smaller individual can pass through dense vegetation, shelter in limited spaces, and survive on fewer calories. Lower body weight reduces stress on joints and may make climbing easier. Against these advantages stand real limitations shorter stride, reduced absolute strength, and greater vulnerability to large predators. Evolution does not produce perfect designs. It balances costs. Their anatomy therefore reflects compromise rather than deficiency. A tiny brain saves energy but limits neural volume. Short legs reduce caloric demands but constrain speed. Strong arms may help in difficult terrain but do not compensate entirely for small body size. Long feet improve support but alter walking mechanics. Flexible ankles aid balance but may sacrifice some efficiency on flat ground. Every advantage exists within a particular landscape. The most surprising lesson comes from the combination of ancient-looking anatomy and late survival. Some wrist, shoulder, and limb features would seem more at home in fossils far older than the Liang Bua skeleton. If Homo floresiensis descends from Homo erectus, then island evolution may have altered the body in ways that revived or retained primitive-looking forms. If the lineage descends from an earlier branch of Homo, those traits may represent genuine inheritance from a deep ancestor. No single explanation fully accounts for every region of the skeleton. This is why their appearance remains difficult to reconstruct. Popular images often give them a modern human face on a small body, or exaggerate primitive features until they resemble caricatures. Neither approach is secure. Skin color, hair distribution, facial soft tissue, and body composition are unknown. Tropical conditions make darker pigmentation plausible, but no direct evidence survives. Their faces were likely recognizably human, yet different in proportions and structure. Beyond that, certainty fades quickly. Even sex estimation for LB1 has been discussed, though the individual is generally interpreted as female. With so few complete skeletons, normal variation within the species is almost impossible to measure. Researchers cannot yet say how much larger males may have been, whether body proportions varied across regions of the island, or whether the Liang Bua population differed from the earlier Mata Menge hominins in subtle ways. The body from the cave is therefore both revealing and misleading. It offers more anatomical detail than many hominin discoveries, but it still represents one life within an immense and changing population. LB1 cannot carry the full weight of the species alone. What the skeleton does show is that Homo floresiensis was not simply a reduced human. It was a distinct anatomical solution, assembled through ancestry, isolation, scarcity, terrain, and time. Every unusual bone records a history of adaptation that began long before Liang Bua. To understand where that history began, the body must be placed back into the argument that has divided researchers from the moment of discovery, whether the people of Flores descended from a familiar Asian ancestor that became radically smaller, or from a far older human branch whose journey eastward has left almost no other trace. The argument over ancestry begins with a problem that seems simple only from a distance. Homo floresiensis lived in Southeast Asia, and Homo Erectus had already occupied Java for an immense span of time. Java lies to the west of Flores, separated by islands and deep channels but close enough to make an eastward dispersal plausible. The straightforward explanation is therefore that a population related to Asian Homo erectus crossed into Wallacea, reached Flores, became isolated, and gradually evolved a much smaller body. It is a powerful model because it connects geography, chronology, and the well-known effects of island life. But the skeleton from Liang Bua refuses to fit neatly inside it. Homo erectus is generally taller, longer-legged, and larger-brained. Its body is adapted for efficient terrestrial movement, and its skull carries a recognizable combination of thick cranial bone, a long, low vault, and a strong brow region. If the Flores population descends from Homo erectus, island dwarfing must explain not only the reduction in height and brain size, but also the unusual wrists, shoulders, feet, limb proportions, and other features that appear more primitive than expected. Some researchers consider that entirely possible. Evolution under isolation can reshape growth in ways that do not preserve every ancestral proportion. Others argue that the transformation required is so extensive that a deeper origin becomes more likely. The competing hypothesis places Homo floresiensis closer to Homo habilis, or another early branch near the base of the genus Homo. Under this interpretation, the ancient-looking anatomy is not produced secondarily on Flores, it is inherited. A small-bodied, small-brained population leaves Africa or descends from an early dispersal that has not yet been adequately documented, travels across southern Asia, and eventually reaches the Indonesian islands. If so, the Flores fossils preserve the last known survivors of a lineage whose continental history has almost completely vanished. That possibility is more dramatic, but it carries a serious evidentiary burden. Fossils of Homo habilis and similarly early forms are known primarily from Africa and date far earlier than the Liang Bua remains. No secure trail of matching fossils stretches from Africa across Asia to Flores. To accept an ancient origin, researchers must allow for an enormous missing record populations crossing continents and islands without leaving fossils that have yet been recognized. The fossil record is certainly incomplete enough to hide much, but absence over such a distance cannot be ignored. The Homo erectus model has the opposite strength. It begins with a species already present in the region. Homo erectus reached Java by at least the early Pleistocene and persisted there for hundreds of thousands of years. It possessed the terrestrial mobility to expand widely, and populations associated with early stone tool traditions could survive across varied habitats. From Java, movement eastward through the islands is geographically easier to imagine than an undocumented dispersal by a much earlier Homo directly from Africa. Yet geography alone does not settle ancestry. Similar locations do not guarantee direct descent, and bones preserve evolutionary relationships imperfectly. Researchers compare dozens or hundreds of anatomical characters, asking whether each feature resembles Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus, Homo sapiens, or another fossil group. These analyses can produce different family trees depending on which fossils are included, how traits are defined, and whether some characters are treated as more evolutionarily informative than others. A major phylogenetic analysis published in 2017 concluded that Homo floresiensis could belong near Homo habilis, or an even earlier branch rather than descending directly from Homo erectus. The result drew attention because it treated the Hobbit's primitive features as a coherent ancestral signal rather than a collection of quirks caused by dwarfism. The jaw, skull, shoulder, wrist, pelvis, and limbs appeared to preserve a pattern difficult to derive from the known anatomy of Homo erectus. But evolutionary trees built from morphology are not final verdicts. Body size reduction can change multiple traits at once. Developmental timing can produce proportions that resemble those of earlier species. Features assumed to be ancestral may be influenced by function, growth, or mechanical demands. Two unrelated lineages can also evolve similar shapes under similar pressures. The distinction between retained primitive anatomy and newly evolved resemblance is one of the hardest problems in paleontology. Teeth have become particularly important because they preserve well and can contain subtle information about ancestry. The Mata Menge fossils include dental traits that resemble Javan Homo erectus in several respects, offering support for the idea that the Flores lineage began with an erectus-like founder. The teeth are small, but reduction in size is exactly what an island dwarfing model predicts. Their combination of shape and proportion suggests continuity with an Asian population more readily than with Homo habilis. Even this evidence does not close the case. Teeth respond to diet and body size as well as ancestry. A small population under unusual ecological pressure may alter dental dimensions rapidly. The known sample remains limited, and there may have been multiple early Homo populations in Asia whose anatomy is poorly represented. The category Homo erectus itself covers a great deal of variation across geography and time. The founding population on Flores may not have looked exactly like the classic fossils used for comparison. The debate is therefore not simply Homo erectus against Homo habilis. It may involve an unknown Asian branch related to one, both, or neither in a straightforward way. Early human evolution is increasingly understood as a branching network rather than a tidy sequence of named species. Populations separate, reconnect, adapt locally, and sometimes exchange genes. Fossil names impose boundaries on a record that was originally made of living groups with variation and movement. Flores adds isolation to that complexity. A small founding population may carry only part of the anatomical diversity of its source. This founder effect can make descendants look unusually distinct even before natural selection begins reshaping them. Over many generations, genetic drift amplifies some traits while eliminating others. Scarcity favors reduced energetic demands. Growth patterns shift. The final body may differ so strongly from the source population that ancestry becomes difficult to recognize. Brain size illustrates the problem. Homo erectus generally possessed a much larger brain than Homo floresiensis, and the reduction required would be substantial. Critics once considered such a decrease unlikely. Yet island evolution can produce dramatic reductions in both body and brain, especially when energetic demands change. A smaller brain does not need to preserve the same relationship to body mass as in a mainland ancestor. Selection may favor metabolic savings even if some cognitive capacities are altered. The shoulders, wrists, and feet remain harder to explain. Some researchers argue that these regions retain structures inconsistent with descent from Homo erectus. Others note that the postcranial skeleton of early Asian Homo is poorly known, making the comparison less secure than it appears. We possess many Homo erectus skulls and far fewer associated hands, feet, and complete limbs. The ancestor may have carried more variation than the surviving fossils reveal. DNA could transform the debate, but none has been recovered. Flores is warm, humid, and destructive to ancient genetic material. Proteins preserved in teeth may eventually offer another route, as they have for other difficult fossils, but the available evidence has not yet delivered a definitive molecular placement. Until then, anatomy and chronology must bear most of the weight. What survives in the record suggests that the Homo erectus dwarfing model currently has strong support, particularly from the geographic setting and the earlier fossils from Mata Menge. It requires no entirely unknown transcontinental migration by a very primitive human. It explains the reduction in body size through a process well documented among island mammals. It also fits the presence of Homo erectus in nearby Java. Still, the opposing model survives because some anatomical features remain genuinely difficult. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire skeleton. To describe the ancestry as solved would replace one oversimplification with another. The most responsible picture is therefore provisional. An erectus-like population may have crossed the sea and undergone profound island evolution, but that founder could have been more primitive than the Javan fossils usually used as its model. Alternatively, an earlier Homo dispersal may have reached Asia without leaving a clear continental trail. Flores preserves the descendants, but not the journey that brought them there. The answer lies somewhere before Liang Bua, before the tiny skeleton, and perhaps before the island itself acquired its modern shape. To approach it, the story must move deeper into time, to a river basin in central Flores where a few teeth and a fragment of arm bone reveal that the Hobbit's extraordinary body was already present 700,000 years ago. Mata Menge lies far from the cool limestone chamber of Liang Bua, in the open landscapes of the Soa Basin where volcanic sediments, river deposits, and ancient soils preserve a much older chapter of human life on Flores. The fossils found there are not dramatic in appearance. There is no nearly complete skeleton, no recognizable face, and no collection of bones arranged in a way that immediately suggests an individual life. Instead, the evidence consists of teeth, fragments of jaw, and a small section of upper arm bone. Yet these modest remains answer one of the most important questions raised by the Hobbit discovery. The tiny body at Liang Bua was not a recent accident. Around 700,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens existed, hominins on Flores were already extraordinarily small. The clearest evidence comes from a fragment of humerus, the long bone of the upper arm. At first, its size created uncertainty. A bone so small might easily be assumed to belong to a young individual whose growth was incomplete. Detailed examination, however, indicates that the bone came from an adult. Its microscopic structure and degree of development show that growth had already finished. The owner was not a child, this was an extremely small adult human. Estimates based on the fragment suggest a body at least as small as the famous LB1 skeleton and possibly smaller. The exact height cannot be reconstructed from a partial arm bone with complete confidence, but the scale is unmistakable. The people living at Mata Menge were not merely on the way toward dwarfism. By this point, the process had already produced one of the smallest known forms of the human genus. The teeth deepen that conclusion. Fossils from several individuals have been identified, representing a small population rather than one unusual body. Their dimensions are reduced, and some are even smaller than corresponding teeth from Liang Bua. At least 4 individuals appear to be represented in the broader Mata Menge sample. That number remains tiny by the standards of population biology, but it is enough to weaken explanations based on a rare disease affecting a single person. A stable pattern is beginning to emerge across time. Small teeth, small jaws, a very small adult arm. Hundreds of thousands of years later, similarly reduced humans appear at Liang Bua. The fossil sequence between the two sites is incomplete, and researchers cannot follow every generation from Mata Menge to the later Hobbit population. Even so, what survives strongly suggests a deep evolutionary continuity on Flores. the landscape around Mata Menge would have looked different from the environment known by the Liang Bua population. Volcanic activity repeatedly transformed the basin. Rivers shifted course, ash buried surfaces and created new soils, grasslands, woodland patches, and watercourses expanded or contracted with climate. Stegodon moved through the region, while giant rat-sized reptiles occupied their own niches. Hominins entered this system not as dominant rulers, but as one adaptable species among many. Stone tools found in the Soa Basin show that tool-making populations were present on Flores well before the Mata Menge fossils. Some archaeological evidence suggests hominins reached the island around 1 million years ago or earlier. The exact relationship between the earliest toolmakers and the 700,000-year-old fossils remains uncertain because no complete skeleton accompanies the oldest artifacts. Yet the simplest interpretation is that a founding population arrived, became isolated, and changed rapidly under island conditions. How rapidly is difficult to determine. If the ancestors arrived around 1 million years ago, there may have been several 100,000 years for major body size reduction before the Mata Menge individuals lived. In evolutionary terms, that is substantial but not immense. Island mammals sometimes shrink rapidly when strong ecological pressures favour smaller bodies. Limited food, reduced competition, altered predation, and the high energetic cost of maintaining a large frame can transform body size across surprisingly short geological intervals. Hominins add further complexity because their survival depends not only on anatomy, but also on learned behaviour. A population capable of producing stone tools can modify its relationship with food and risk. Sharp flakes allow access to flesh, tendons, skin, wood, and plants. Social learning preserves useful techniques. Shared knowledge compensates for individual physical limitations. The island therefore selects not simply for a smaller animal, but for a smaller tool using human whose anatomy and behaviour evolved together. The Mata Menge fossils provide important support for descent from an erectus-like ancestor. Their dental characteristics share similarities with Homo erectus from Java, while their overall size is dramatically reduced. This combination fits a scenario in which larger mainland hominins cross into Wallacea and undergo island dwarfing. The teeth do not look exactly like those of Homo habilis, nor do they require a separate ancient lineage to explain every feature. But the evidence does not eliminate the older branch hypothesis entirely. Teeth and a fragmentary arm cannot reveal the full anatomy of the Mata Menge people. Their wrists, shoulders, feet, skulls, and brains remain unknown. It is possible that the more primitive features seen at Liang Bua were already present in the earlier population. It is also possible that some emerged later through further adaptation. The fossil record between these periods is too sparse to track the sequence. What Mata Menge changes most decisively is the timescale. When Homo floresiensis was first discovered, some critics suggested that LB1 might be a pathological modern human or a very recent local anomaly. A population of tiny hominins living 700,000 years ago makes that position far more difficult to defend. The unusual size belongs to an evolutionary lineage, not to an isolated medical condition. The site also reveals that island dwarfing did not occur only near the end of the species' history. It was established early and then maintained for a remarkable duration. This persistence suggests that the small body was not a temporary response to one drought or one period of scarcity. It was a successful long-term adaptation within the ecological limits of Flores. Success, however, should not be confused with stability in every detail. The people of Mata Menge and Liang Bua may not have been anatomically identical. Hundreds of thousands of years separate them. climate changed, volcanoes reshaped habitats, animal populations rose and declined. Different valleys may have supported isolated groups that evolved along slightly different paths. The later species could represent descendants of the Mata Menge population, a related branch, or a mixture of populations that moved within the island. Even the formal name Homo floresiensis creates a sense of unity that the fossils cannot fully prove. Researchers often place the Mata Menge remains within or near the Homo floresiensis lineage, but species boundaries across such long periods are difficult to define. Biological populations do not transform on a single date. Changes accumulate gradually. A jaw from one layer and a skeleton from another may belong to different stages of the same lineage without being identical in every trait. The tiny humerus offers another lesson. Human evolutionary discoveries are often associated with skulls because faces and brain cases seem to carry identity. Here, a small piece of limb bone becomes equally transformative. It shows that the island's influence reached the entire body. It also suggests that body size can evolve more dramatically than earlier models assumed. Even within the genus Homo, a human ancestor arriving on Flores may have begun with a tall, long-legged form usually associated with continental Homo erectus. Over generations, descendants require fewer calories, mature differently, and occupy a reduced bodily scale. Their brains may shrink alongside their bodies, though not necessarily at the same rate. Their limbs change in proportion. Their gait adapts to rough terrain. The resulting population no longer resembles the founder closely, yet it continues making tools and navigating the same dangerous island. No written memory preserves this transformation. No generation notices that it's becoming part of a new species. Individuals are simply born into bodies that vary slightly from those of their parents. Some survive drought better, some require less food, some reach maturity with smaller frames. Across thousands of generations, small differences accumulate until the descendants become something the original colonists would scarcely resemble. By the time the Mata Menge individuals walk through the Soa Basin, the transformation is already advanced. They move beneath volcanic slopes carrying stone flakes, watching for reptiles, following water, and competing for the limited resources of an island surrounded by deep sea. They are not miniature visitors from the mainland anymore. They belong to Flores. And the tools scattered through even older deposits suggest that the first chapter of this transformation begins with an achievement as mysterious as the body itself somehow. A human population crossed water that had never disappeared, reaching an island beyond every Ice Age shoreline. The water separating Flores from the continental world is not an illusion created by modern coastlines. Even during the coldest phases of the Ice Age, when sea level falls and broad plains emerge across western Indonesia, the deepest channels remain open. Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Asian mainland become connected within the greater landmass known as Sunda. But farther east the pattern breaks apart. Between Sunda and the ancient continent of Sahul lies Wallacea, a zone of islands that can be reached only by crossing water. Any hominin arriving on Flores therefore performs an act that once seemed far beyond the expected abilities of such ancient humans. For much of modern archaeological history, deliberate sea travel was treated as a comparatively recent achievement, associated with Homo sapiens and the cognitive complexity of our own species. Earlier hominins were imagined spreading across connected land, following coastlines and river valleys but stopping whenever deep water blocked the route. The islands of Wallacea undermine that assumption. Stone artifacts occur in places that were never joined to the mainland. and some are now known to be more than 1,000,000 years old. On Sulawesi, northeast of Flores, stone tools from the site of Kelio have pushed the human presence in Wallacea much deeper into the early Pleistocene. Dating of the deposits indicates that hominins were there at least around 1.04 million years ago, with the possibility that the occupation reaches back roughly 1.48 million years. The tools are few compared with the immense archaeological records of later periods, but their significance comes from geography. Sulawesi has always been separated from the Western Islands by substantial marine channels. Whoever made those artifacts crossed open water long before modern humans existed. No human fossil was found beside the tools, so the identity of the makers remains unknown. They cannot confidently be called Homo floresiensis, and the discovery does not prove that the Flores lineage ever lived on Sulawesi. The tool makers may have belonged to Homo erectus, another early Asian Homo population, or a lineage not yet represented by recognizable bones. What the site demonstrates is broader and perhaps more unsettling. Very ancient hominins were capable of reaching isolated islands across Wallacea, and Flores was not necessarily an exceptional accident. The same uncertainty surrounds the earliest tools on Flores. Archaeological sites in the Soa Basin show that hominins were present there around 1 million years ago. The oldest deposits contain artifacts but no securely associated human skeletons. By 700,000 years ago, the tiny Mata Menge population is present, yet several 100,000 years separate those fossils from the first known tool makers. It is possible that the earliest arrivals were their direct ancestors. It is also possible that more than one dispersal reached the island and that later populations replaced, mixed with, or descended indirectly from earlier settlers. Stone survives where bodies disappear. A sharp flake can endure in sediment after tropical heat destroys bone and DNA. As a result, the first island crossings are preserved as evidence of activity without identity. A tool reveals that someone was present, but it does not disclose the traveller's face, body size, language, or purpose. The people who entered Wallacea remain shadows defined by the barriers they somehow crossed. The simplest crossing may have been accidental. Tropical storms can tear large mats of vegetation from riverbanks and carry them into the sea. Animals occasionally colonize islands in this way. A group of hominins sheltering or feeding near a flooded river could have been swept offshore on tangled trees and debris. Currents might then carry the raft toward another island. Such events would be rare, dangerous, and impossible to control. But geological time offers many opportunities for rare events to occur. Accidental rafting, however, does not eliminate the deeper problem. Establishing a lasting population usually requires more than one survivor. A small group would need to include enough adults to reproduce and maintain social knowledge. They would have to reach land alive, find fresh water quickly, recognize edible resources, and survive unfamiliar predators and diseases. A single accidental arrival might leave no enduring lineage. The archaeological record suggests successful colonization, which demands a fortunate chain of events, even if no planning is involved. Deliberate crossing presents a different challenge. If ancient hominins intentionally entered the water, they may have used simple rafts, tied logs, bamboo bundles, or other perishable structures. None would be expected to survive for 1 million years. The absence of boats therefore proves little. Yet deliberate travel would imply foresight gathering materials, coordinating a group, transporting tools or food, and aiming toward land that may not have been clearly visible. Some islands in Wallacea can be seen from neighbouring high points under favourable conditions. Smoke, birds, cloud formations, and floating vegetation may also reveal the existence of land beyond the horizon. A crossing need not begin with an abstract map. It can begin with repeated observation. People living along a coast notice currents, winds, tides, and the direction of migrating birds. Knowledge accumulates even without formal navigation. The evidence does not yet distinguish clearly between accident and intention. Scholars still debate how much maritime ability should be attributed to early Pleistocene hominins. There may not be one answer. The first crossing could have been accidental, followed much later by repeated movement that became increasingly deliberate. Different islands may have been colonized through different processes. A storm-driven raft and a planned voyage can produce the same archaeological result, stone tools appearing beyond a permanent sea barrier. The ocean itself would have shaped which travellers survived. Currents in the Indonesian archipelago are powerful and complex, moving through narrow channels between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Monsoon winds reverse seasonally. Tidal flows can carry floating objects far from their intended route. A crude raft launched at the wrong time could vanish into open water. At another season, the same current might deliver people to a nearby shore. The crossing to Flores may have occurred in stages rather than through one long voyage. Hominins moving east from Java could pass through a chain of islands, each requiring another stretch of water. Sea levels changed the distances, but never removed every crossing. From one island, a population might remain for generations before another group moved onward. The migration could therefore unfold over centuries or millennia without any individual understanding that a major geographic boundary was being crossed. This slow process changes the image of expansion. It is not necessarily a heroic expedition led by explorers staring into the sunrise. It may be a sequence of ordinary movements searching for food along a coast, following animals, escaping conflict, collecting shellfish, or being carried beyond a familiar bay. Human range expands because small decisions accumulate. Reaching an island also creates a new evolutionary situation. The sea that allows entry becomes a wall behind the colonists. Return may be difficult or impossible. Contact with the source population weakens, genetic diversity narrows, cultural traditions develop in isolation. On Flores, the founding population encounters limited large prey, unusual predators, volcanic disturbance, and a restricted land area. The crossing is therefore not simply an episode of travel. It is the event that makes the later Hobbit anatomy possible. The ancient toolmakers may have possessed no sophisticated maritime culture in the modern sense. They did not need sails, carved canoes, or celestial navigation to change human history. They needed only to survive one barrier that earlier researchers assumed they could not cross. Once that happened, the island did the rest. The Sulawesi evidence widens this perspective. Flores is part of a larger pattern in which hominins penetrate a broken tropical world long before Homo sapiens. Unknown populations move through islands whose archaeology is still barely explored. Some may vanish without descendants. Others may persist for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies could change in ways not yet represented by fossils. The tiny humans of Flores may be only the first such experiment modern science has recognized. This possibility makes Walliser one of the most important missing landscapes in human evolution. Tropical erosion, volcanic activity, rising seas, and poor fossil preservation conceal much of its record. Ancient coastlines now lie underwater. Caves remain unexcavated. Stone tools may wait beneath sediments on islands where no systematic survey has yet occurred. Each discovery has the potential to reveal another crossing or another isolated lineage. What survives already proves that early humans were less confined than once believed. Their world did not end at the shoreline. Water was a danger, but not an absolute boundary. Whether carried by storms or propelled by intention, hominins reached islands beyond the visible continent and established populations in environments unlike those their ancestors had known. On Flores, the descendants of one such arrival become smaller, walk differently, and endure through ages of climatic and volcanic change. The sea crossing begins the transformation, but it also traps the population inside an ecosystem where every animal follows its own unusual path. There, small humans share the landscape with miniature elephant relatives, oversized rodents, immense birds, crocodiles, and giant lizards whose teeth leave their own record on the bones of the dead. Flores is not an island of miniature creatures alone. It is an island of distorted scale, where familiar evolutionary rules seem to loosen and rebuild themselves. Along river banks and through open woodland, dwarf relatives of elephants move beneath volcanic ridges. Giant rats occupy the undergrowth. Large birds stalk the ground. Crocodiles wait near water. Komodo dragons patrol the landscape as patient, muscular predators. Homo floresiensis lives inside this altered world not as its unquestioned master, but as one small-bodied participant among animals shaped by the same isolation. The most famous of these neighbours is Stegodon, a branch of the elephant family that once ranged widely across Asia. On Flores, different Stegodon populations appear at different times, including forms much smaller than their mainland relatives. Island dwarfism reduces the energy required to maintain a massive body where vegetation and water may fluctuate. Even so, a dwarf stegodon is not a harmless or truly tiny animal. Depending on the species and individual, it can still outweigh a Homo floresiensis many times over. Its bones offer meat, fat, marrow, hide, and other useful materials. But the living animal remains powerful, dangerous, and difficult to kill. For years, popular reconstructions often showed groups of hobbits hunting stegodon with stone-tipped weapons, surrounding the animals through coordination and bringing them down as reliable large prey. The image is vivid because the bones of stegodon and stone artifacts occur within the same archaeological setting, yet association alone does not establish how the animals died. A carcass can enter the human food supply through hunting, scavenging, natural death, predator attack, or a combination of events separated by hours or days. The island's reptiles make that distinction especially important. Komodo dragons are not simply oversized lizards. They are powerful predators and scavengers equipped with serrated teeth, strong neck muscles, and an exceptional ability to locate carrion. Their relatives have occupied Flores for a very long time. Tooth marks preserved on animal bones show that large varanid lizards reached carcasses and fed from them. Any Homo floresiensis approaching the same remains would have entered a contested space where meat attracted danger. A fresh carcass lying near a river or an open ground could be visible from a distance. Birds gather, the smell carries. Reptiles arrive and tear at the richest muscle groups. Hominins may approach later, watching from cover and waiting for an opportunity. Their small bodies and stone flakes allow them to cut tissue from less obvious areas, sever tendons, remove scraps, or break smaller bones. This is not a passive or insignificant strategy. Scavenging around large predators demands timing, awareness, group coordination, and a detailed understanding of animal behavior. The landscape offers many such opportunities. Stegodon may become trapped in mud, weakened by drought, injured on rough terrain, or isolated from a herd. Volcanic events can kill animals or disrupt migration routes. Seasonal water shortages concentrate different species around shrinking sources. Homo floresiensis does not need to hunt healthy adults regularly to benefit from Stegodon. The death of even one individual creates a temporary abundance of food far beyond what a small group could consume immediately. Preservation complicates this picture. Large bones survive more readily than plant remains, insects, soft tissue, or many small animals. As a result, Stegodon can appear more important in the archaeological record than it was in daily nutrition. Homo floresiensis almost certainly consumed a wider range of foods. Giant rats provide smaller and more manageable packages of meat. Reptiles, birds, eggs, shellfish, roots, fruits, tubers, nuts, leaves, and insects may all have contributed depending on season and location. Direct evidence for many of these foods is poor, especially in tropical environments where organic remains decay quickly. Giant rats are among the island's most remarkable creatures. Some reach several kilograms, large enough to provide meaningful food while remaining easier to capture or process than Stegodon. Their bones are found at Liang Bua in great numbers, determining whether each animal was brought in by hominins, owls, other predators, or natural processes requires careful taphonomic analysis. Cut marks, tooth damage, breakage patterns, burning, digestion, and the distribution of skeletal parts all help reconstruct how an accumulation formed. The evidence remains incomplete, but these rodents may have been among the most practical animal resources available. Large birds also inhabit Pleistocene Flores. One extinct marabou stork stands considerably taller than Homo floresiensis. Such a bird could scavenge carcasses, prey on smaller animals, or compete for food. Its presence adds another layer to an ecosystem where a diminutive human is surrounded by creatures that challenge modern expectations. Some birds tower over them, rats grow to unusual size, elephant relatives shrink, predatory lizards remain immense. This altered scale shapes behavior. Homo floresiensis cannot depend on physical dominance. Their safety likely comes from vigilance, cooperation, knowledge of shelter, and the ability to use tools. A cave such as Liang Bua offers protection from weather and some animals, though it is not necessarily occupied continuously or exclusively by humans. Different species may use the cave at different times. Sediments accumulate slowly, mixing traces of shelter, feeding, predation, floods, and natural death. Outside the cave, movement requires constant reading of the environment. Tracks reveal where Stegodon passed. Disturbed vegetation may signal a large reptile. Bird calls change when predators approach. Water quality shifts with season and rainfall. Edible plants appear in particular soils and elevations. Stones suitable for flaking must be recognized, collected, and sometimes carried. None of this knowledge survives in a fossil, yet without it the population could not have endured. The island is also volcanically active. Eruptions can transform habitats abruptly, covering vegetation with ash, redirecting rivers, and burying living surfaces. In the Soa Basin, volcanic deposits help preserve and date ancient sites. But for the people living through them, eruptions are ecological crises. Animals move or die. Water becomes contaminated. Familiar routes disappear. New landscapes later emerge from the ash. Over hundreds of thousands of years. Homo floresiensis survives not one stable island but many successive versions of Flores. Climate imposes slower changes. Wet periods expand forests and water supplies. Dry periods open grasslands. reduce rivers, and intensify competition around dependable springs. Stegodon populations respond to these shifts, and hominins must respond in turn. Their small size reduces daily energy demands, but it does not remove dependence on functioning ecosystems. If large animals decline, plant foods fail, and water becomes scarce at the same time. Even a highly adapted population faces pressure. Crocodiles add danger around rivers and wetlands. Komodo dragons threaten on land. Large scavenging birds compete from above. Yet Homo floresiensis is not simply prey moving through a hostile bestiary. Stone tools alter the balance. Sharp edges allow access to resources unavailable to teeth and hands alone. Groups can defend a carcass briefly, process food quickly, or exploit remains after a predator has moved away. Knowledge makes dangerous places usable. The relationship between hominins and predators may have varied from one event to another. At times, humans may arrive first at a natural death and remove valuable tissue before dragons find it. At other times, reptiles may kill or open an animal, leaving behind portions that humans later exploit. In some cases, both may return repeatedly. Taphonomic evidence preserves the final sequence only imperfectly. Cut marks can overlap tooth marks. Weathering erases surfaces. Bones move through sediment. No single pattern describes every carcass. This is the world in which the Hobbit body makes sense. Short stature reduces energy needs. Strong upper limbs may help with climbing, carrying, or processing. Long feet and mobile ankles assist movement over irregular ground. A small brain reduces metabolic cost while still supporting the learned traditions necessary for survival. The anatomy is not designed for a universal human future. It is tuned to a particular island filled with unpredictable resources and dangerous competitors. Flores therefore does not make Homo floresiensis weak. It makes physical power less important than patience, timing, memory, and ecological familiarity. They survive beside animals much larger than themselves because they know where to move, when to wait, what to cut, and what to avoid. For generations beyond counting, they cross the same valleys beneath volcanic peaks, leave stone flakes beside animal bones, and return to caves that preserve only fragments of their presence. Their island appears strange to modern eyes, but to them it is simply the whole world, a place of giant rats, dwarf proboscideans, watchful reptiles, seasonal water, and narrow opportunities seized carefully enough to keep a small human lineage alive. A stone flake lies where a hand released it tens of thousands of years ago. Its edge is sharp enough to slice hide, separate tissue, trim wood, or cut fibrous plants. But there is nothing visually elaborate about it. It carries no carved symbol, no polished surface, and no design meant to impress another observer. To modern eyes, it may appear almost too simple to represent a long-lived human culture. On Flores, however, survival does not depend on making the most complicated object. It depends on making the right edge at the right moment and knowing exactly how to use it. Homo floresiensis lives without many of the advantages later humans take for granted. There is no evidence of metal, pottery, agriculture, permanent architecture, or long-distance exchange networks. Regular control of fire at Liang Bua is uncertain. Large animals are dangerous rather than reliably available. The island limits movement, raw materials, and contact with other populations. Yet these constraints do not produce immediate failure. The lineage survives through an immense span of time, which means that its apparently modest technology works within the world for which it is intended. Stone tools from Flores are generally produced through direct percussion. A hammerstone strikes a suitable core, removing flakes with cutting edges. Some pieces are further modified, but many require little additional shaping. The method is technically less elaborate than later blade industries or carefully prepared core technologies, yet even basic flaking requires control. The maker must recognize stone that will fracture predictably, choose an angle, judge the force of the blow, and understand where the resulting edge is likely to appear. A poor strike can shatter the core, blunt the edge, or injure the hand. This knowledge is learned rather than instinctive. Young members of a group would have watched experienced toolmakers handle discarded flakes and gradually developed the coordination needed to strike stone effectively. The exact teaching methods are unknowable. There may have been demonstration, imitation, gesture, correction, or spoken instruction. No fossil reveals language, and the evidence remains incomplete. But a technology lasting across generations implies reliable social transmission. Skills do not persist for hundreds of thousands of years unless they are repeatedly passed on. The tools also reveal planning at a practical scale. Suitable stone does not occur everywhere. People must remember where it can be collected and may carry cores or finished flakes away from the source. A cutting edge can be produced when needed, but preparation begins earlier, with the selection and transport of raw material. The distance involved may be modest, yet the principle is important. Homo floresiensis does not merely react to whatever lies directly in front of them. They move through a remembered landscape in which certain places offer stone, others water, shelter, plant foods, or animal remains. Their bodies influence how this landscape is used. Short legs reduce stride length, making rapid travel across open ground less efficient than it would be for taller humans. The long feet and unusual ankle structure may have created a gait different from our own. Yet Flores rarely offers long, flat roots, slopes, river banks, roots, loose rock, and volcanic surfaces favor careful placement over sustained speed. A person who moves steadily and securely may be better suited to such terrain than one built primarily for distance running. The newer fibular evidence strengthens the view that Homo floresiensis is fully committed to walking on two legs. Their lower limbs are not those of an animal divided between upright and quadrupedal locomotion. They stand, travel, and carry objects bipedally. At the same time, the ankle may have retained greater mobility than in modern humans. Combined with strong upper limbs and other primitive-looking features, this leaves open the possibility that climbing remained useful. Climbing need not mean spending most of life in trees. A flexible body could help when ascending steep slopes, reaching food, crossing fallen timber, entering elevated shelter, or escaping immediate danger. Trees may provide fruit, eggs, honey, insects, or a temporary refuge from large reptiles. Limestone landscapes also contain ledges, broken rock faces, and cave entrances that require scrambling. The ability to combine upright walking with occasional climbing would be practical in a rugged island environment. Their small body makes such movement less energetically costly. A 25-kilogram adult places less weight on a branch and requires less force to raise the body. Small size also allows passage through dense vegetation and narrow spaces, but reduced mass carries disadvantages. Absolute strength is lower, reach is shorter, and a small individual is more vulnerable when confronted by a predator or large animal. Survival depends on avoiding contests that cannot be won. This may explain why ecological knowledge is as important as technology. Homo floresiensis must recognize not only useful resources but dangerous timing. A river crossing safe in the dry season may become deadly after rain. A carcass that offers food may also attract dragons. A fruiting tree can draw multiple animals to the same place. A cave may be protective during one period and occupied by other creatures during another. The island is not a collection of fixed resources. It is a pattern of changing opportunities. Seasonal memory would therefore be essential. The inhabitants of Flores likely knew when water sources weakened, where tubers remained available during dry months, and which valleys retained vegetation after surrounding areas browned. They would recognize the behavior of Stegodon, rats, birds, and reptiles not as abstract species but as recurring signs. Tracks, droppings, calls, disturbed soil, and feeding marks all carry information. Much of their diet remains invisible. Animal bones preserve better than leaves, fruit, pith, roots, or insects, giving meat an exaggerated presence in many archaeological reconstructions. Stone tools can process animal tissue, but they can also cut plants, sharpen digging sticks, open tough coverings, and prepare materials that decay completely. Microscopic wear and residues sometimes reveal such activities at other sites. But the evidence from Homo floresiensis remains limited. Their food economy was probably broader than the surviving bones suggest. A digging stick, wooden spear, basket, cord, hide container, or simple shelter can transform survival while leaving almost nothing after tens of thousands of years. Stone artifacts may therefore represent only the durable fraction of a much larger technological system. It would be a mistake to imagine that the people of Flores carried only rocks, because only rocks survive. Wood is abundant in tropical settings and can be shaped with sharp flakes. Plant fibers can be twisted or woven. Leaves can wrap food or provide cover. None of these possibilities is securely demonstrated for Homo floresiensis, but preservation strongly favors stone over nearly every other material they could have used. Even their use of caves may be misunderstood if Liang Bua is imagined as a permanent home. The cave could have served intermittently as shelter, a processing place, a resting point, or a location returned to during particular seasons. Occupation layers accumulate across long intervals and may combine brief visits separated by years or generations. Smoke-blackened ceilings and orderly domestic spaces cannot be assumed, especially when regular fire use is uncertain. Their lives probably extended across open landscapes, temporary shelters, river margins, and are resource zones far beyond the excavated chamber. Social organization is even harder to recover. Small-bodied hominins living among predators would benefit from cooperation, but group size is unknown. Island populations may have been sparse, with bands moving through overlapping territories and meeting periodically. Cooperation could aid vigilance, food sharing, tool learning, and care during injury. Yet no burial practice, habitation arrangement, or genetic sample reveals the structure of their communities. What can be said is that solitary survival would be difficult. Knowledge accumulates socially. Tool-making traditions persist socially. Routes, dangers, and seasonal resources can be shared. Even without complex material culture, a group can hold a rich map of its environment through memory. That information may be the most important technology Homo floresiensis possesses. Their apparent simplicity therefore reflects the limits of the record as much as the limits of the species. Archaeology preserves the hardest materials and the most unusual events. It rarely preserves an ordinary day waking in shelter, checking the weather, following a familiar path, collecting plants, repairing a wooden object, watching animals from a distance, or returning with food before darkness. Yet it is those ordinary days, repeated successfully across thousands of generations, that explain their endurance. The people of Flores do not survive by overpowering the island. They survive by fitting within it. Their bodies consume little. Their feet negotiate rough ground. Their hands produce dependable edges, and their communities preserve knowledge that no artifact records directly. They may climb when climbing helps, walk when walking is safest, and avoid risks that larger humans might confront. Their technology is simple because simplicity is sufficient until changing climate, declining resources, or new competitors begin to alter the balance. Before that pressure becomes decisive, however, the bones at Liang Bua reveal one further correction to the familiar image of the Hobbit. These small humans may not have been the fearless hunters of dwarf elephants so often imagined, but more cautious opportunists entering a carcass landscape already claimed by powerful predators. The image of Homo Floresiensis as a determined hunter of Stegodon has always carried a certain dramatic appeal. A group of small humans surrounds a young elephant relative, sharp stone tools ready, using cooperation and intelligence to overcome the difference in size. It is an easy scene to imagine because stone artifacts and Stegodon bones occur together at Liang Bua. Yet the newest analysis of those bones suggests a more complicated relationship, one shaped not only by hunting but by competition, scavenging, timing, and the dangerous presence of other meat-eaters. Bones do not preserve intention, they preserve damage. A cut mark made by a stone edge can show that a hominin removed flesh, separated a joint, or worked around a tendon. A tooth mark can reveal that a predator or scavenger bit into the same carcass. Fractures may indicate marrow extraction, trampling, sediment pressure, or natural breakage. The challenge is to reconstruct the order in which these events occurred, who arrived first, which parts were still available. Did humans kill the animal, discover it after death, or approach after another predator had already fed? A detailed taphonomic study published in 2026 examined these questions through the Stegodon remains from Liang Bua. The researchers compared the locations of stone tool cut marks with tooth damage caused by Komodo dragons and other processes. The pattern does not strongly support the familiar picture of Homo floresiensis routinely killing healthy Stegodon and controlling the carcass from the beginning. Instead, the richest portions of the body often show greater evidence of carnivore feeding. Tooth marks cluster more heavily on bones associated with substantial muscle. Hominin cut marks tend to occur in areas where less flesh would remain. This distribution is consistent with the sequence in which a large reptilian predator, or another carnivore, reaches the carcass first and removes the most desirable tissue. Homo floresiensis then arrives later and extracts what remains. That does not make them helpless scavengers waiting passively for scraps. Approaching a carcass occupied or recently abandoned by a Komodo dragon is a calculated risk. Modern Komodo dragons are capable of defending food aggressively, and their ancient relatives would have represented a serious threat to a human weighing little more than 20 kilograms. A small group would need to observe carefully, wait for the right moment, and work quickly. The ability to recognize whether a reptile has moved away temporarily or finished feeding could mean the difference between acquiring food and becoming vulnerable beside the same carcass. Scavenging is sometimes treated as behavior inferior to hunting, but this hierarchy reflects cultural assumptions more than ecology. Many successful predators scavenge when the opportunity appears. Lions take abandoned kills, hyenas hunt as well as steal, wolves feed from naturally dead animals, Early humans almost certainly combined hunting, scavenging, and gathering in proportions that changed with place and season. Refusing available meat because another animal reached it first would be wasteful, especially on an island where large food packages are uncommon. For Homo floresiensis, scavenging may have been especially efficient. A Stegodon carcass contains far more tissue than one predator can consume immediately. Even after the richest muscle groups are removed, scraps remain around joints, the skull, the feet, the spine, and other difficult areas. Tendons, skin, organs, and marrow may still be accessible. Stone flakes give hominins a tool that reptiles do not possess, a thin edge capable of cutting precisely into places teeth have not fully cleared. Their small hands and bodies may also be useful when working around a partly consumed carcass. They can crouch close, reach between bones, and remove tissue quickly. The food gained may not match the abundance available to the first feeder, but it can still be significant for a small-bodied group whose daily caloric needs are modest. The evidence does not prove that Homo floresiensis never hunted Stegodon. Archaeology rarely permits such absolute conclusions. They may have killed calves, injured animals, trapped individuals, or occasionally finished a weakened Stegodon. A young animal separated from adults would be far more manageable than a healthy mature one. Drought, mud, volcanic disturbance, or injury could create opportunities in which active killing played a role. No single explanation fully accounts for every bone accumulation. What the new analysis weakens is the claim that regular, organized Stegodon hunting formed the central foundation of their subsistence. The carcass evidence appears more opportunistic. Homo floresiensis takes advantage of animals that die naturally, become weakened, or are opened by predators. Hunting and scavenging may overlap rather than exclude one another. The distinction matters because it changes the way their intelligence is imagined. Bringing down large prey is often used as a dramatic symbol of cooperation and planning. Yet waiting, observing, reading predator behavior, and entering a carcass at the safest moment also require complex judgment. The skill lies not in overpowering the animal, but in understanding the sequence of the landscape. A Komodo dragon leaves signs, tracks press into mud, drag marks lead toward cover, feeding scatters bones and exposes fresh surfaces. Birds gather overhead. The direction of wind carries scent. Homo floresiensis would have learned to interpret such signals over generations. The carcass is not merely food, it is an event unfolding among species. The relationship may even have been indirect and recurring. A hominin group could discover an injured Stegodon and follow it at a distance. Knowing that weakness increases the chance of death, reptiles might do the same. After the animal falls, different consumers arrive in stages. Birds and insects begin immediately. Large reptiles open the body. Hominins cut remaining tissue. Smaller scavengers return later. The bones eventually weather, move, and enter cave deposits or river sediments. Liang Bua preserves only the end of that sequence. The original landscape may have been some distance from the cave. Bones could be carried in by hominins, predators, water, or several processes. The presence of cut marks proves access to animal tissue, but not control over the entire carcass. The presence of teeth proves carnivore feeding, but not necessarily the kill. Every mark records contact, not motive. The same caution applies to smaller animals. Giant rats, birds, reptiles, and other creatures may have been hunted more actively because they posed less danger. A broad diet would reduce dependence on Stegodon and make scavenging large carcasses one option among many. Plants, insects, eggs, and aquatic resources may have provided more regular food, even though they leave weaker archaeological traces. There is also a practical advantage to arriving after a predator. A Stegodon hide is thick, and opening a fresh carcass can require considerable effort. Large reptilian teeth may expose internal tissue that small hominins could not reach quickly on their own. In this sense, the predator performs the first stage of butchery. Homo floresiensis then uses stone edges to exploit the opened body. The relationship is competitive, but it can also create opportunity. This does not imply deliberate cooperation between species. The dragons are dangerous rivals, not partners, yet ecosystems often produce benefits without intention. One animal's feeding exposes resources for another. The hominins survive by recognizing that pattern. The revised picture is quieter than the heroic hunting scene, but perhaps more revealing. Homo floresiensis does not dominate Flores through force. They operate within a narrow margin, using caution and tools to acquire food without taking unnecessary risks. They understand when to approach, when to withdraw, and which parts of a carcass still justify danger. Their survival depends on flexibility rather than one specialized strategy. They can cut meat when meat is available, gather plants when it is not, capture smaller animals, and exploit the remains left by powerful competitors. This opportunism may help explain how a small population endures through changing climates and uneven resources for so long. Yet one supposed advantage remains uncertain. A controlled fire could drive predators away, provide warmth, cook difficult foods, preserve meat, and extend activity into darkness. For years, darkened bones and cave deposits seem to suggest that the hobbits possessed this protection. The latest evidence makes that assumption much harder to defend. Fire seems so closely tied to humanity that its absence can feel almost impossible. It warms the body, hardens wood, cooks food, discourages predators, lights darkness, and gathers a group into a shared space. In many accounts of prehistory, controlled fire becomes one of the defining steps between merely surviving in a landscape and transforming it. For Homo floresiensis, however, the evidence from Liang Bua now suggests that this familiar foundation may have been far less secure than once assumed. Darkened bones were once interpreted as signs of burning. Sediment discoloration and the association of stone tools with animal remains encouraged the image of small humans sitting around hearths inside the cave. Such a scene seemed reasonable. Homo erectus populations elsewhere are sometimes linked with early fire use, and if Homo floresiensis descended from an erectus-like ancestor, perhaps the ability had travelled with them to Flores. The cave offered shelter, animal bones lay nearby, and black surfaces appeared to complete the picture. The problem is that darkness on bone does not always come from flame. Minerals can stain fossil surfaces. Manganese in particular can form black coatings that resemble charring. Chemical changes during burial may darken bone unevenly. Sediment pressure, water movement, and microbial activity can alter texture and color. To identify burning securely, researchers must look beyond appearance and examine microscopic structure, heat-related cracking, warping, color progression, and chemical signatures. The 2026 analysis of the Liang Bua animal remains tested thousands of bones with this distinction in mind. More than 4,000 small animal specimens were examined, yet the study did not identify convincing evidence that they had been heated in a controlled fire. Several blackened surfaces previously interpreted as burning were better explained by mineral deposits, especially manganese staining. Nor did the Stegodon remains provide a persuasive pattern of cooking. This does not prove that Homo floresiensis never encountered or used fire. Archaeological absence is not absolute absence, especially across a long history represented by limited excavated areas. A fire lit outside the cave may leave little trace. Temporary hearths can be destroyed by trampling, flooding, erosion, or later occupation. Ash disperses, charcoal decays or moves. A population could also use fire irregularly, perhaps only when natural flames were available without maintaining permanent hearths. What the evidence weakens is the stronger claim that the Liang Bua population routinely controlled fire as part of daily life. That distinction matters because controlled fire is more than exposure to flame. Lightning strikes and volcanic activity can ignite vegetation. After such events, animals may be found dead or weakened, and cooked plant foods may become available by accident. Hominins can approach a natural burn and exploit it without knowing how to produce fire independently. They may preserve embers for a time, carry smouldering material, or lose the flame when conditions change. Full control requires some reliable combination of making, transporting, maintaining, and using fire. On volcanic Flores, natural fire would not have been unknown. Eruptions, dry season burning, and lightning could create opportunities. Homo floresiensis may have recognized recently burned areas as useful places where animals were exposed. Roots softened, vegetation cleared, and fresh growth later attracted prey. Yet familiarity with fire in the landscape is not the same as possessing it at will. If regular fire use was absent, daily survival becomes harder to imagine through modern assumptions. Nights in a tropical cave are not always warm. Elevation, rainfall, wind, and dampness can make shelter cold, especially for a small-bodied human with a high surface area to mass ratio. Fire would reduce that stress, but other strategies remain possible. Groups may sleep close together, use dry vegetation, hides, leaves, or protected recesses, and choose occupation seasons carefully. A smaller cave chamber can retain body heat better than an exposed site. Darkness also changes behavior. Without artificial light, activity narrows after sunset. The deeper cave becomes difficult to use unless moonlight or daylight reaches it. Homo floresiensis may have occupied areas near the entrance rather than the interior, arranging life around the daily rhythm of sunrise and dusk. Their knowledge of terrain would need to compensate for the inability to travel safely at night. Predators create another problem. Fire can deter many animals, though not always reliably. Without it, a cave is not automatically secure. Komodo dragons can enter sheltered spaces. Other scavengers may investigate food remains. Homo floresiensis would need to keep sleeping areas relatively clean, choose defensible positions, maintain group vigilance, and avoid storing large quantities of meat where scent would attract danger. The absence of regular fire also affects the Stegodon question. Cooking allows meat to be softened, parasites reduced, and some nutrients made easier to digest. Raw meat remains edible, especially when fresh, but it must be processed quickly in a tropical climate. Small groups approaching a partially consumed carcass may cut away limited portions and eat them soon after acquisition. Drying, smoking, or prolonged preservation would be difficult without dependable heat. Plant foods present a similar challenge. Many roots and tubers are easier or safer to consume after cooking. Some contain toxins that heat helps break down. Without fire, Homo floresiensis would depend more heavily on plants edible raw, or on preparation methods involving pounding, soaking, peeling, fermenting, or repeated washing. Wooden and stone tools could support such methods even if almost no trace survives. This may help explain why broad ecological knowledge was so important. A group without reliable cooking cannot treat every potential food as usable. It must distinguish safe species from dangerous ones, recognize ripeness, know which tissues can be eaten raw, and understand where seasonal foods occur. The mental map of the island becomes a substitute for part of the flexibility fire provides. Yet caution is necessary here as well. The Liang Bua evidence applies most directly to the deposit studied, not automatically to every Homo floresiensis population across hundreds of thousands of years. Earlier hominins in the Soa Basin may have behaved differently. Other caves may preserve hearths that Liang Bua does not. Technology can be lost as well as gained, especially in small isolated populations. If a skill depends on specialists or rare materials, demographic decline can interrupt its transmission. The possibility of cultural loss is important. Human technologies do not advance in a straight line. A population may abandon techniques that become unnecessary, difficult, or unreliable. Small groups are especially vulnerable to losing complex knowledge when experienced individuals die without enough learners. If the ancestors of Homo floresiensis once controlled fire, isolation and declining population size could theoretically have weakened that tradition. There is currently no direct evidence that such a loss occurred, but it cannot be dismissed simply because technological change is often imagined as permanent progress. Alternatively, they may never have needed routine fire in the same way later humans did. Flores provides abundant biomass, a relatively warm climate, and food resources that can be consumed without cooking. Fire is advantageous, but it is not equally essential in every environment. A lineage adapted to low-energy living may survive without the metabolic benefits that cooking provides to larger-brained humans. This possibility challenges one of the strongest modern habits of thought, the belief that all successful humans must eventually converge on the same package of traits: large brain, efficient stride, advanced hunting, controlled fire, symbolic culture, and expanding territory are often presented as linked stages. Homo floresiensis breaks that package apart. They remain small-brained, isolated, and technologically conservative. They may scavenge as often as they hunt. They may use little or no regular fire. Still, they endure. Their success is therefore not a lesser version of the Homo sapiens strategy. It is another strategy entirely. Around the cave entrance, daylight would have shaped the rhythm of work. Stone was struck in the morning or afternoon. Animal tissue was cut while visibility remained good. Plant foods were gathered before darkness. As evening approached, the group withdrew into shelter without the glow modern imagination so readily inserts. The cave became quieter, cooler, and darker. Beyond the entrance, reptiles move through the same night landscape. No hearth has to burn for human memory to continue. Knowledge can gather around voices, gestures, routine, and shared presence rather than flame. Tools can be taught in daylight. Routes can be remembered. Food can be divided. Danger can be watched for collectively. Fire may deepen social life, but its uncertain presence does not erase social life. The darkened bones of Liang Bua once seemed to illuminate the Hobbit world. Closer analysis instead returns much of that world to shadow. Yet the shadow is scientifically valuable. It forces a more careful reconstruction, one in which Homo floresiensis survives not because researchers grant them every familiar human advantage, but because their actual adaptations may have been sufficient. What remains after the fire is removed from the story is not helplessness. It is resilience stripped of assumption, a small human lineage living beside giant lizards, processing food with stone, moving through rough terrain, and preserving a way of life that leaves few dramatic objects behind. Those few objects now become even more important, because if fire, hunting, and elaborate technology cannot define their culture, then the quiet persistence of simple stone traditions must carry much of what can still be known. Stone is the most durable witness on Flores, but it is also one of the least talkative. A flake can survive volcanic ash, flooding, burial, and tens of thousands of tropical seasons. It can preserve the point where a hammer struck a core and the direction in which force travelled through the rock. Yet it cannot reveal the name of the maker, the meaning of the task, or the relationships among the people standing nearby. The tools of Homo Floresiensis endure precisely because almost everything surrounding them disappears. Across the Soa Basin and Liang Bua, stone artifacts document a tradition of practical cutting technology that persists for an extraordinary length of time. The tools are usually small flakes, cores, and pieces modified only as much as necessary. They lack the visual symmetry of later hand axes, the standardized blades of Upper Paleolithic industries, or the delicate points associated with complex hunting weapons. Their apparent simplicity once encouraged a dismissive interpretation. Perhaps the makers possessed limited intelligence and could do little more than strike one stone against another. Closer study makes that conclusion difficult to sustain. A usable flake is not produced by random impact alone. The maker must select material that breaks predictably, identify a suitable platform, hold the core securely, and direct a controlled blow. Each removal changes the shape of the core and influences what can be taken from it next. Even when the final object looks irregular, the sequence behind it can involve repeated decisions. Some flakes are sharp enough to use immediately. Others are retouched to strengthen an edge or create a more specific working shape. The technology is economical. It produces cutting edges without investing excessive time in objects that may be lost, broken, or discarded after short use. On an island where raw material availability varies from place to place, this flexibility is useful. A core can be carried and reduced as needed. A fresh flake can be made near a carcass, plant processing area, or temporary shelter. There is no requirement to spend hours shaping a highly formal tool if a simpler edge performs the task effectively. One lesser-known detail is that the size of the tools does not provide a straightforward measure of the maker's body. Small flakes may reflect the dimensions of available stone, the desired cutting task, or the stage of core reduction rather than simply small hands. Homo floresiensis was tiny, but archaeologists cannot look at a miniature artifact and assume that only a miniature human could have made it. Conversely, the presence of larger pieces would not prove a larger body population. Tool size and body size are related only indirectly. At Mata Menge, stone artifacts occur in the same general ancient landscape as the small hominin fossils. This strengthens the association between toolmaking and the Flores lineage, but the relationship must still be described carefully. Archaeological layers represent accumulated activity, and the exact hand responsible for any single flake cannot be identified. At even earlier sites where only tools survive, the maker remains entirely unknown. Those artifacts may belong to the ancestors of Homo floresiensis, but they could also represent another population whose bones have not been found. At Liang Bua, the association becomes more persuasive because Homo floresiensis remains and stone tools occur within overlapping periods of cave use. Still, even there, The final tool-bearing layers approach a time when Homo sapiens may have been entering the wider region. The youngest artifacts cannot automatically be assigned to the Hobbit population without considering chronology and stratigraphy. Stone technology alone does not carry a species label. This is one reason the cultural history of Flores remains difficult to reconstruct. A similar flaking method can be used by different human populations. Simple stone technologies are especially hard to distinguish because the basic physics of fracture encourages recurring solutions. Two groups do not need to meet or share ancestry to discover that striking a core at the correct angle produces a sharp edge. Yet the long continuity of toolmaking on Flores is meaningful. Knowledge survives environmental disruption, demographic change, and isolation. The techniques may evolve in subtle ways that are difficult to recognize, but the core principle remains dependable. A stone edge continues to solve problems across hundreds of thousands of years. This persistence invites a larger question. Does technological stability indicate cultural limitation? Or does it show that the tradition remained well matched to local needs? Modern societies tend to equate frequent innovation with intelligence and success. New objects replace old ones, and visible complexity becomes a sign of progress. That expectation does not always apply to small prehistoric populations. Innovation spreads most readily through large networks where many individuals exchange ideas. Flores may have supported sparse groups separated by terrain, distance, and changing habitats. Contact with outside populations was probably rare or non-existent for long periods. Under such conditions, cultural traditions can remain conservative because the number of experiments is limited and proven methods carry less risk. Population size also affects whether new skills survive. An individual may discover a more efficient way to shape stone, prepare food, or construct a wooden implement. For that innovation to persist, others must observe, learn, and transmit it. If the inventor dies before enough people acquire the technique, the knowledge disappears. In a small, isolated population, cultural loss can occur even when individuals are fully capable of learning. The surviving tools therefore reveal both ability and vulnerability. Homo floresiensis can maintain essential knowledge across generations, but the archaeological record does not show rapid accumulation of increasingly elaborate technologies. Their culture may have been rich in perishable practices that are now invisible, while the stone component remained deliberately stable. Or the limits of population size, communication networks, and available resources may genuinely have constrained technological change. The evidence remains incomplete. Almost nothing is known about symbolic behavior. No engraving, figurine, painted surface, ornament, or formal burial can be securely attributed to Homo floresiensis. This absence should not be converted into proof that they lacked symbolism. Tropical preservation is poor. Excavated areas are limited, and symbolic objects can be made from wood, feather, fibre, skin, or pigment that leaves a little trace. At the same time, there is no responsible basis for imagining elaborate rituals simply because such behaviour would make them feel more familiar. Their social world survives indirectly. Repeated tool traditions imply learning. Long-term occupation implies shared ecological knowledge. Survival among predators likely favours cooperation. Injured or less mobile individuals may have benefited from group support, though no skeleton provides a clear case of prolonged care comparable to evidence discussed for some other hominins. Group size, mating patterns, territorial behaviour, and kinship organisation remain unknown. Language presents an even greater mystery. Stone tool manufacture can be taught by observation and gesture, but spoken communication would make the transfer of routes, dangers, food knowledge, and social rules far more efficient. Anatomy offers no decisive answer because the relevant soft tissues do not survive, and the fossil sample is too incomplete to reconstruct vocal capacities confidently. Homo floresiensis may have used a structured vocal system, but its complexity cannot be inferred from brain size alone. Their minds are therefore most visible through repeated decisions. A raw stone is carried rather than ignored. A useful angle is selected. A flake is detached. An edge is used on bone or another material. The same sequence appears again in later deposits because someone has learned it from someone else. Culture exists in that repetition, even when its stories and symbols are gone. The tools also preserve mobility. Artifacts found away from raw material sources indicate that people moved stone through the landscape. The distances may not be vast, but they reveal planning across space. A group leaving a known source could carry a core because sharp edges might be needed later. Such preparation is quiet evidence of anticipation. Useware studies and experimental comparisons show how much can be accomplished with simple flakes. They can slice meat, scrape hide, cut reeds, shape wood, and process fibrous plants. One tool may serve several purposes before being discarded. The absence of specialized forms does not mean the absence of specialized behavior. A general cutting edge becomes specific through the task chosen by its user. Wooden technology may have been especially important. Sharpened sticks can dig for tubers, probe animal burrows, reach fruit, or serve as defensive implements. Simple containers made from bark or leaves could transport food and water. Cordage could bind materials together. None of these has been recovered securely, but stone flakes provide the means to manufacture them. What survives in stone may therefore represent the gateway to an entire missing world of perishable objects. That hidden world cautions against reconstructing Homo floresiensis as intellectually trapped within the visible archaeological record. Their culture was almost certainly larger than the collection of rocks now held in museums. At the same time, it must remain grounded in what is actually known. There is no evidence of boats from their later history, no verified art, and no complex hunting arsenal. Possibility should widen the picture without filling every silence. For hundreds of millennia, the stone tradition is enough. It helps a small human population fit within the island rather than transform it beyond recognition. The tools do not produce ecological dominance. They provide access to flesh, plants, wood, and opportunities that bare hands and teeth could not exploit as efficiently. But no tool tradition exists apart from the environment supporting its makers. A sharp edge cannot restore a vanished water source. Social knowledge cannot make Stegodon abundant when habitat contracts. Low energy requirements offer protection against scarcity, but only to a point. As rainfall begins to decline and the island's dry season grows harsher, the long balance between body, culture, and landscape starts to weaken. Rain does not vanish from Flores in a single catastrophic season. The change is slower, uneven, and therefore more dangerous. A river that once flowed through the dry months becomes shallow sooner. Pools shrink before the rains return. Grasslands spread where woodland had offered shade and edible plants. Familiar routes remain visible, but they lead to fewer dependable resources. For a population whose survival depends on intimate knowledge of the landscape, gradual change can turn inherited wisdom into an increasingly unreliable map. Climate evidence now provides a clearer view of this transition near the end of the known Homo floresiensis occupation at Liang Bua. Reconstructions published in 2025 suggest that annual rainfall on Flores declined substantially between roughly 76,000 and 61,000 years ago. Average precipitation may have fallen from around 1,560 millimeters to approximately 990 millimeters per year. The shift was not simply a reduction in total rain. Summer conditions became especially dry, with severe aridification developing around 61,000 to 55,000 years ago. These numbers describe more than weather. They describe the narrowing of an ecosystem. Flores is already a seasonal island shaped by monsoon circulation and steep topography. Different valleys can receive very different amounts of rain. A dry year in one region may be less severe in another. Yet prolonged aridification changes the reliability of the entire system. Streams become intermittent, wetlands contract, vegetation produces less food. Fires caused by lightning or volcanic activity may spread more readily through dry landscapes. Animals gather around the remaining water sources, increasing both opportunity and competition. For Homo floresiensis, small body size provides some protection. A smaller human requires fewer calories than a larger one. Less water is needed each day. Short travel distances between food patches may remain possible, even when overall productivity declines. The same island adaptation that has sustained the population for hundreds of thousands of years becomes a buffer against ecological stress. But a buffer is not immunity. The decline of Stegodon appears to coincide broadly with the changing climate. These elephant relatives depend on vegetation and dependable access to water. As summer dryness intensifies, their preferred habitats may contract or shift away from the Liang Bua region. Smaller populations become more vulnerable to disease, reproductive failure, volcanic disruption, and local overexploitation, even if Homo floresiensis rarely hunts healthy adults. The disappearance of Stegodon removes an important source of occasional large carcasses. Scavenging opportunities become less frequent precisely when other foods may also be under pressure. A Stegodon carcass is valuable because it briefly concentrates enormous energy in one place. Without such events, the inhabitants of Flores must rely more heavily on small animals, plants, insects, and scattered resources requiring greater daily effort. Giant rats may remain available, but their populations also respond to vegetation and rainfall. Fruit trees fail in poor seasons. Tubers become harder to locate in dry ground. Birds change their range. The entire food web contracts in ways that no single archaeological layer can fully record. Water may have been the more immediate problem. Liang Bua is well positioned within a valley, but cave occupation still depends on accessible fresh water outside. A group can tolerate lean hunting if plant foods and streams remain dependable. It cannot remain long where drinking water repeatedly fails. Movement becomes necessary, and movement carries its own risks. The Liang Bua fossils of Homo floresiensis are now generally placed between about 87,000 and 61,000 years ago, within the best supported recent interpretations, while broader dating of the skeletal deposits extends toward roughly 100,000 years. Their disappearance from the cave record near 61,000 years ago aligns strikingly with the onset of severe summer aridity. This does not prove that drought killed the species. It suggests that environmental deterioration may have made the Liang Bua region increasingly difficult to occupy. That distinction is essential. A population leaving one cave has not necessarily vanished from an island. Homo floresiensis may have moved toward wetter highlands, coastal zones, or valleys where springs remained dependable. Flores contains varied microclimates, and even during widespread drying, refuges may have survived. Small groups could abandon Liang Bua without leaving a clear archaeological trail elsewhere. Caves suitable for preservation are unevenly distributed, and only a fraction have been excavated. Open-air camps are far more vulnerable to erosion, vegetation, and later disturbance. The final fossil at Liang Bua therefore records the end of evidence in that location, not the final breath of the species. Archaeology rarely captures extinction directly. It captures the last object that happened to survive and the last layer researchers have found. Climate pressure may also have fragmented the population. As water sources shrink, groups become concentrated around isolated refugees or separated by increasingly dry territory. Contact between communities declines. Genetic diversity narrows. Mates become harder to find. Tool-making knowledge and local ecological traditions remain within smaller social networks. A lineage already limited by island geography becomes divided into even smaller populations. This process can be fatal without producing a dramatic catastrophe. Extinction often occurs not through one spectacular event but through a sequence of ordinary failures. Fewer adults reproduce. A disease affects one small group. A volcanic eruption destroys a productive valley. Several dry seasons arrive close together. An experienced toolmaker dies before knowledge is fully transmitted. A water source fails at the wrong time. No single cause is sufficient, yet the population becomes less able to recover from the next disturbance. Volcanism remains a constant background risk on Flores. Eruptions can bury landscapes, but they can also interact with drought in complex ways. Ash may temporarily damage vegetation and contaminate water. Later, volcanic soils can become fertile. A resilient population can survive isolated eruptions by moving, but when habitats are already contracting, safe alternatives become fewer. Climate stress turns events once absorbed by the system into potentially decisive shocks. Komodo dragons and other competitors would also gather near declining resources. Waterholes become places where prey, predators, scavengers, and hominins encounter one another more frequently. The same concentration that makes animals easier to locate increases danger. Homo floresiensis may find weakened Stegodon or other carcasses during drought, creating brief abundance, but these opportunities come amid a broader ecological collapse. Feeding from one dead animal cannot compensate for a landscape that supports fewer living ones. Their lack of confidently demonstrated regular fire use may further limit flexibility. Fire could help process difficult plant foods, preserve meat, clear vegetation, and provide protection at temporary camps. Without dependable control, the population remains more closely bound to foods edible through cutting, pounding, peeling, or raw consumption. As familiar resources decline, the range of usable replacements may be narrower than it would be for a fire-dependent cooking culture. Yet it would be misleading to describe Homo floresiensis as helpless before climate change. Theirs have already survived hundreds of millennia of environmental variation. Their ancestors endure volcanic episodes, shifting rainfall, and changing animal communities. They likely move between habitats and adjust their diet repeatedly. The drying phase near 61,000 years ago becomes important not because they have never faced stress, but because several pressures may finally converge. Stegodon declines, summer rainfall collapses, water becomes less reliable, groups may fragment, volcanic instability continues. The ecosystem supporting the Liang Bua population loses resilience at the same time that the wider human world is changing beyond Flores. Somewhere to the west, north, or southeast, Homo sapiens is spreading through island Southeast Asia, The precise timing of modern human arrival on Flores remains uncertain, and no site securely captures an encounter between the two species. Climate change alone may explain why the hobbits disappear from Liang Bua before any contact occurs. Alternatively, environmental decline may force them into new territories, just as another human population enters the region. No single explanation fully accounts for the silence that follows. The cave floor records fewer traces, than none that can confidently be assigned to Homo floresiensis. Stegodon also fades from the sequence. The ecosystem represented in the older layers begins to dissolve. What had seemed permanent across countless generations proves dependent on rainfall patterns, animal populations, and the continued existence of local refugees. For the people living through it, there is no knowledge that an age is ending. The dry season simply lasts longer. A familiar pool is empty. A herd does not return. A route once followed by older generations leads toward dust and sparse grass. The group moves elsewhere, expecting perhaps to return when conditions improve. At Liang Bua, they never do. The silence after Liang Bua is easy to mistake for an ending. Fossils disappear from the cave deposits around 61,000 years ago, while stone tool activity associated with the older occupation continues only to roughly 50,000 years ago. Beyond those layers, the familiar traces of Homo floresiensis no longer appear. No later skeleton emerges. No younger jaw confirms survival. No final campsite has been found elsewhere on the island. The record simply stops. But extinction is rarely preserved as a clean event. The last known fossil is not necessarily the last living member of a species. It is only the youngest individual whose remains have survived, been buried in a datable context, and later been discovered. A small population could continue for thousands of years without leaving a fossil that modern archaeologists recognize. Groups may shift away from caves, occupy open-air sites that erode, or move into parts of Flores where excavation has barely begun. Tropical soils destroy bone rapidly. Rivers rearrange sediments. Volcanic deposits bury landscapes deeply. The absence of later remains is meaningful, but it is not a witnessed death. This distinction becomes especially important because Homo sapiens is moving through the wider region at roughly the same broad period. Modern humans reach Sahel, the combined Ice Age continent of Australia and New Guinea, by at least around 65,000 years ago according to some evidence, though the exact timing and routes remain debated. To reach Sahel, populations must pass through Wallacea. That makes some form of human movement near Flores plausible before the Hobbit record ends. Plausible is not the same as proven. No archaeological layer on Flores securely shows Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis occupying the same place at the same time. No skeleton carries an unmistakable wound caused by the other species. No shared hearth, mixed burial, or exchange object preserves a moment of contact. No genetic material has been recovered from Homo floresiensis, so interbreeding cannot be tested directly. The idea of two human species meeting on the island remains one of the most compelling possibilities in the story, but the evidence remains incomplete. Popular accounts often move too quickly from overlapping regional timelines to a scene of confrontation. Modern humans arrive, the hobbits disappear, and the newcomers are assumed to have caused the extinction. This sequence is attractive because it offers a clear culprit and a dramatic ending. Yet chronology alone cannot establish causation, especially when the dates themselves contain uncertainty and the relevant sites are sparse. Climate deterioration begins before the final known Homo floresiensis fossils. Stegodon declines at the same time. the Liang Bua population may already be withdrawing from a drying valley before Homo sapiens reaches Flores in significant numbers. If so, modern humans could arrive after the local Hobbit population has vanished, encountering only abandoned habitats and ecological change. Another possibility is that the two populations overlap indirectly. Homo sapiens may occupy coastal zones while Homo floresiensis remains in interior valleys. Flores is narrow compared with a continent, but its mountains, forests, river systems, and seasonal barriers can separate groups. They might live on the same island for generations without frequent contact. Smoke on a distant slope, unfamiliar footprints, or altered animal behavior could reveal the presence of others before any close encounter occurs. If contact does happen, it need not begin with violence. Different human populations can avoid one another, observe from a distance, exchange materials, compete silently for food, or occupy different ecological niches. Homo sapiens may possess broader social networks, more flexible technology, dependable fire use, and perhaps projectile weapons. But these advantages do not automatically produce direct conflict. Competition can operate through resources rather than confrontation. A larger, more connected population can change an ecosystem simply by entering it. Modern humans may hunt small animals more efficiently, exploit coastal food, move between habitats rapidly, and maintain contact with groups beyond the island. Even low numbers can reduce prey availability around water sources or disturb areas previously used by Homo floresiensis. For a lineage already stressed by drought and declining Stegodon, slight additional pressure could matter. Disease is sometimes proposed as another mechanism, though direct evidence is absent. Two long-separated human populations may carry different pathogens or immune vulnerabilities. Contact could expose one group to infections it has never encountered. Yet ancient disease rarely preserves clearly enough to test this scenario, and invoking it without evidence risks replacing one unknown with another. Interbreeding presents a quieter possibility. Homo sapiens mixed with Neanderthals and Denisovans, demonstrating that distinct human lineages sometimes exchange genes. Could the same have happened on Flores biologically? It cannot be ruled out in the abstract. But no authenticated Homo floresiensis DNA exists, and genomic studies of modern island populations have not revealed a clear Hobbit contribution. The short-statured Rampasasa people living near Liang Bua once attracted speculation that they might descend from Homo floresiensis. Genetic research does not support that interpretation. Their ancestry includes the Neanderthal and Denisovan components expected in regional modern human populations, but no distinctive signal points to interbreeding with the Hobbit lineage. Their small stature appears to have evolved independently, probably through a separate response to island conditions. This is one of the most striking examples of evolutionary convergence in recent human history. Two unrelated human populations occupy the same island at vastly different times, and both develop reduced body size. Flores does not preserve a living remnant of Homo floresiensis in its modern inhabitants. Instead, it appears to have shaped modern Homo sapiens along a partially similar path. The absence of a detected genetic signal does not absolutely prove that no interbreeding ever occurred. A small contribution can disappear through genetic drift, especially if the recipient population remains small or later receives substantial ancestry from newcomers. Current methods may also fail to identify DNA from an unknown lineage when no reference genome exists. Still, there is no positive evidence for Hobbit ancestry in living people, and it should not be presented as fact. Competition remains possible, but so does demographic absorption without a lasting detectable trace. a very small Homo floresiensis population could be overwhelmed numerically even without widespread conflict. If only a few scattered groups survive after the climatic decline, the arrival of larger Homo sapiens networks changes the demographic balance completely. The newcomers exchange mates across wider distances, share resources, and recover from local losses more easily. The isolated population cannot. This may be the most important contrast between the two human strategies. Homo floresiensis is exquisitely adapted to Flores, but that specialization is tied to isolation. Its survival depends on a limited ecosystem and a small social world. Homo sapiens carries a different form of resilience, extensive cooperation, flexible technology, long-distance exchange, and the ability to move between environments. One lineage fits deeply within a single island. The other spreads across many. When conditions remain stable, the island specialist can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. When climate changes rapidly and another adaptable human population enters the region, the same specialization becomes vulnerable. Still, the exact cause of disappearance cannot be reduced to one factor. Drought may drive groups from Liang Bua. Stegodon decline may remove a crucial resource. Volcanic events may destroy refuges. Small population size may produce inbreeding and demographic instability. Homo sapiens may add competition, disease, displacement, or occasional conflict. Each mechanism is plausible, but no single explanation fully accounts for the end. The most likely reality may be cumulative. Homo floresiensis does not disappear because one decisive event sweeps across Flores. Their population contracts as rainfall falls, groups become isolated, food webs weaken. Some move and fail to establish new territories. Others survive temporarily in refuges. Births no longer balance deaths. Then, perhaps, unfamiliar humans appear along coasts or river valleys, introducing another pressure into a system already near its limit. Extinction at such a scale would be almost invisible to those living through it. There is no final assembly of the species, no awareness that only a few communities remain. Each group knows only its own valley, neighboring bands, and remembered routes. One community disappears after a failed season. Another loses contact. A third survives for several generations beyond the others. Eventually, a birth occurs that will never be followed by enough new births to sustain the lineage. Somewhere on Flores, the last Homo floresiensis may have lived long after Liang Bua was abandoned. That individual would not know they were the last. The island would still contain familiar mountains, reptiles, rats, trees, and stone. The sea would still surround everything. Nothing in the landscape would announce that a human form surviving for hundreds of thousands of years was about to pass out of the living world. Then the record closes completely, leaving no body, no tool, and no certain witness to the final moment. The story left behind on Flores is not the story of a failed human species waiting to be replaced. It is the record of an evolutionary path shaped by deep water, isolation, scarcity, and time. A population reaches an island that has never been connected to the continental mainland. Its descendants become smaller, reorganize their growth, retain unusual anatomical features, and learn to survive among animals unlike those found almost anywhere else. They persist not for a few desperate generations, but for hundreds of thousands of years. That duration should change the language used to describe them. Homo floresiensis was not abandoned by evolution. Evolution has no forward line from primitive to advanced, and no species is placed on hold while another moves ahead. The people of Flores continued changing because their environment continued selecting among bodies, behaviors, and developmental patterns. Smallness was not evidence that progress had stopped. On an island with limited resources, it may have been one of the reasons they survived so long. The earliest known chapter begins before the tiny fossils of Mata Menge and before the skeleton in Liang Bua. Stone tools show that hominins entered Flores around 1 million years ago or earlier, crossing water that remained open even during the coldest Ice Age periods. Whether the crossing was intentional, accidental, or the result of repeated movements through a chain of islands cannot yet be determined. What matters is that a human population reached a place once assumed to be beyond the abilities of early Homo. The sea then became both boundary and creator. It reduced contact with the population left behind. It narrowed the number of founders and limited later migration. Genetic drift, ecological pressure, and altered growth began working within a small population. By around 700,000 years ago, the hominins at Mata Menge were already extremely small. Their teeth, jaws, and minute adult upper arms show that dwarfism was not an unusual condition affecting one individual at Liang Bua. It was a population-level adaptation established in deep time. The exact identity of their ancestor remains unresolved. The strongest geographic and dental evidence points toward an erectus-like population moving east from Java and becoming dwarfed after reaching Flores. This explanation requires fewer unknown migrations and fits a familiar pattern of island evolution. Yet the primitive-looking shoulders, wrists, feet, and other skeletal features continue to support an alternative possibility. The founders may have belonged to a much earlier branch of Homo whose history across Asia has scarcely survived. Neither model explains every bone perfectly. That may be because the true ancestor does not match any fossil group currently known in complete form. Early Asian human diversity was probably greater than the surviving record suggests. Homo erectus itself may have included populations with anatomical variation that is now invisible because skulls preserve more often than hands, feet, and associated skeletons. The Flores lineage may have begun with a form related to Homo erectus, but more primitive in some regions of the body than the classic Javan specimens. Without DNA, certainty remains distant. Tropical heat and moisture have so far denied researchers the genetic evidence that transformed the study of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Proteins or future molecular methods may eventually offer a clearer answer. But for now, Homo Floresiensis must be understood through anatomy, archaeology, chronology, and ecology. Each kind of evidence provides part of the shape while leaving the center incomplete. What can be reconstructed is a human way of life built around low energy demands and careful opportunity. Homo Floresiensis walks habitually on 2 legs, though with shorter strides, long feet, and ankle mechanics different from those of modern humans. The upper body retains strength and perhaps enough mobility for occasional climbing. Their hands strike stone against stone and produce dependable sharp flakes. These tools remain simple in design, but simplicity does not make them accidental. The techniques must be learned, remembered, and transmitted. Their technology does not visibly accumulate into elaborate weapons, architecture, or symbolic objects. No secure art, ornament, burial, or ritual installation can be assigned to them. Yet the durable record may represent only a small fraction of their culture. Wood, plant fiber, bark, leaves, hides, and spoken knowledge vanish easily in the tropics. A stone flake may once have shaped a digging stick, cut binding material, opened a plant, or repaired a container that left no trace. The absence of evidence should not be filled with invented sophistication, but neither should it be confused with evidence of mental emptiness. The people of Flores knew enough to survive an unstable volcanic island. They recognized water sources, food seasons, animal tracks, dangerous places, and useful stone. Their social groups maintained knowledge across generations. They navigated a world in which a mistake near a Komodo dragon, crocodile, steep ravine, or failing water source could be fatal. The newest analysis of animal bones removes another comforting assumption. Homo floresiensis may not have been a regular hunter of healthy Stegodon. Cut marks and predator damage suggest that they sometimes reached carcasses after large reptiles had consumed richer portions. They may still have hunted smaller animals and occasionally killed vulnerable Stegodon, but scavenging appears to have played a meaningful role. This does not diminish their adaptability, it clarifies it. They survived by reading the order of events around a carcass, approaching after danger lessened, cutting what remained, and leaving before a competitor returned. In an island ecosystem, intelligence may reveal itself not through domination but through restraint. The uncertain evidence for controlled fire points in the same direction. Thousands of animal bones from Liang Bua do not show a persuasive pattern of heating, and some black staining once interpreted as burning is better explained by manganese. Homo floresiensis may have encountered natural fires or used flame occasionally, but routine fire control at the cave is not securely demonstrated. If they regularly lived without fire, their survival becomes even more dependent on environmental knowledge. They had to identify foods edible raw or prepared through cutting, pounding, soaking, peeling, or other methods. They needed shelter from damp nights without assuming a permanent hearth. They shared the landscape with predators without the dependable barrier of flame. A human lineage surviving under those conditions is not evolutionarily unfinished. It is adapted in a way modern humans find difficult to imagine, because so many of our own habits depend on fire. The long experiment begins to weaken when Flores becomes drier. Rainfall declines between roughly 76,000 and 61,000 years ago, and summer aridity becomes severe soon afterward. Water sources shrink, vegetation changes, Stegodon declines. The ecological system that supported Homo floresiensis for so long loses part of its stability. Their small bodies reduce the cost of living, but they cannot create water or restore vanished food. Groups may move away from Liang Bua towards surviving refuges. Some may fragment into populations too small to recover from disease, poor seasons, volcanic disruption, or reproductive failure. Their disappearance from one cave does not prove that the whole species dies at that moment, but the absence of later remains suggests that the lineage was approaching its final stage. Homo sapiens was also moving through Wallacea during this broad period. A meeting remains possible, perhaps even likely somewhere in the region, but it has not been demonstrated on Flores. No site preserves a secure encounter. No genetic evidence reveals interbreeding. No fossil proves conflict. The final disappearance may have occurred before sustained contact, or environmental pressure may have reduced the Hobbit population until the arrival of another human species became one additional strain among many. Their genetic legacy does not appear to survive in the modern people of Flores. The short stature of some living island communities evolved independently. This is not descent from the Hobbit population, but another response by another human species to the same island pressures. Flores produced small-bodied humans more than once, separated by tens of thousands of years and different ancestry. That convergence may be the clearest expression of the island's power. The land does not preserve life unchanged. It channels life. It favors some costs over others, alters growth, narrows possibilities, and creates forms that would be unlikely on a continent. Homo floresiensis was one of those forms, neither a mistake nor a miniature draft of humanity. Their legacy is not found in modern DNA or a living descendant. It survives in the enlargement of the human story. Before Liang Bua, recent human evolution could still be imagined as a narrowing path toward Homo sapiens. After the Hobbit, that path becomes a branching landscape. Different kinds of humans occupy different worlds at the same time. Some adapt to cold plains, some enter high plateaus, some cross seas, some become small enough to live within the energetic limits of an isolated tropical island. The tiny skeleton from the cave does not show what humanity failed to become. It shows how many forms humanity once took. Long after the last Homo floresiensis disappears, the island continues its slow work. Rain falls into the valley, then weakens again. Rivers carry sediment across abandoned surfaces. Volcanic ash settles over old paths. Bones crack, dissolve, or become buried. Stone flakes remain where hands once dropped them, their edges gradually softened by soil and time. The cave does not remember in the way people remember. It keeps no complete story. It preserves a tooth and loses a face, protects one skeleton while allowing generations to vanish, and places the remains of humans, rats, birds, reptiles, and Stegodon into the same dark archive. What reaches the present is not a final account, only enough fragments to reveal that another humanity was here. There is comfort in imagining that survival leaves a clear legacy, that a successful species must produce descendants, monuments, or recognizable influence. Homo floresiensis offers a quieter truth. A lineage can endure for hundreds of thousands of years and still disappear almost completely. Its members can know their island intimately, raise generation after generation, maintain useful traditions, and leave no name behind. Time does not measure significance by what remains visible. Somewhere beyond Liang Bua, perhaps in a valley not yet excavated, the final communities may have watched a dry season lengthen and the familiar animals grow scarce. They may have moved toward water remembered from older journeys, following paths learned from people who were already gone. They could not know that their entire branch of humanity was narrowing around them. The sea still surrounded Flores as it always had. At dusk, the mountains darkened first, then the forest, then the cave entrances. The island that had transformed their ancestors now held the last traces of their existence, and beneath that darkness, for a little while longer, small human feet continued along the ancient paths.